হুম। শুরু হয়ে গেছে তো। হুম, 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 হুম।
Hi, Swati. Will you unmute yourself and speak to me? The photo frames are in a majority because there are four, five if we include mine, and three icons, two S's and one C. Okay. So, just to be clear, can you hear me, Shilajit? And I'm going to repeat myself. So, this is just, yesterday's welcome address, which we missed out on. Is that okay?
Yes, but Ratna, we will not, we'll cut that out. You begin the welcome address, we'll put it for the yesterday's thing.
That's fine. So, I'm going to speak, right?
Yeah.
So, I'll start. Okay.
Shilajit, ma'am will start.
Okay. Good evening. Uh, Good evening. Today is the first evening of the Doris Lessing Society South Asia webinar that is being held online. We welcome all participants and will shortly begin the webinar that we had scheduled at the end of the third week of October. This webinar will engage with Lessing's work and voices from the margins. And this is a collaborative effort through which the DLSSA will continue to showcase the significance and relevance of Lessing's opus. The DLSSA hopes to function as a society that will expand the base of interested Lessing readers and will also provide a fillip to Lessing studies in South Asia. All programs of the DLSSA have been made possible through the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture, Media of West Bengal University, whose director, Professor Chandrava Chakravarti, is here with us today. A brief history of the DLSSA and its inception would now be in order. The coming together of this organization was a labor of love and a dream set into motion through the persistence of Swati Mitra, who collaborated with the very kind and enthusiastic Josna Redje, the president of the Doris Lessing Society. DSL is, of course, the motherboard that nourished Swati and many of us as members and participants, and also held the first International Doris Lessing Conference at New Orleans in 2004. The Doris Lessing Society is an important flagship that, through its annual MLA conferences and newsletters, has continued to sustain interest in scholarship in the Lessing archives long after modern fiction studies brought out scholarly essays on Doris Lessing's writing in a special volume, volume 26 in spring in 1980. I heard about the Golden Notebook in 1982, 20 years after its publication, when I was an undergraduate student. And one of my teachers at the university told me about this. The Golden Notebook by then was a text in one of Delhi University's MPhil programs in English literature. When I enrolled for the MPhil program at the university in the mid 80s, I bought my own first copy of the Golden Notebook. And after that, there was really no looking back. This was still a period before liberalization. Books were not easy to access, and it was an extraordinary privilege to own so many books. When I decided to work on the fiction written by Doris Lessing for my doctoral dissertation, I remember photocopying a frayed edition of Paul Schulater's edited volume entitled A Small Personal Voice, Essays, Interviews, Reviews in its entirety. Years later, at New Orleans, Paul very generously gave me a paperback copy that still occupies pride of place in my library. And I have retained the bound photocopy, and I use both versions at different points in my life when working on Doris Lessing. Paul also gave me a VCT recording of the film Made on the Grass is Singing, which I mailed back to him after viewing it at a relative's home in America. For anyone who's feeling uncomfortable about my infringement of copyright laws, and yes, I did photocopy Paul Schulater's entire book, let me hasten to remind everyone who's listening that my generation lived through days of zero internet and non availability of books, which, when located, proved to be rather expensive. I must also hasten to add that when I received funding to attend a summer school at Edinburgh, I went to the resource library every day and read Retreat to Innocence, a book Lessing had published in 1956 and subsequently recalled. I also hand copied all the poems she had written, feeling particularly thankful that she had only 20 odd poems to offer up. I found older copies of many of Lessing's books on Delhi's numerous pavement bookstores. In fact, I bought the entire collection of Children of Violence with the original carton shelf off the pavement and remain indebted to my unknown benefactor, whose prior purchase enabled me to read Lessing's first sequential novel series immediately instead of waiting for the Delhi International Book Fair or a visiting scholar to get me a recent edition. As you can see, one common thread running through the then and now is the interest in Lessing's work and its consumption in academia as well as the wide world outside of it. To the then and now, which is a reference to time past and time present, if I were to make a small graph diagram, I would have to plot on the x or the y axis the little categories of us and them in the world as they continue to exist. Then, a simple gulf yawned between Asia and Euro America. In those days, it was difficult to acquire Lessing's novels, and building up a collection took a few years. Accessing secondary sources was difficult. Libraries remained ill-stocked. Meeting a Lessing scholar in the pre-Gmail and pre-internet days was pretty much next to impossible. While international conferences and annual MLA conferences have been held, usually in different parts of America and England, and some of us have been able to participate in these, it has involved traveling long distances only after some funding could be arranged. And it has always meant a juggling of academic schedules and a shuffling of one's work and endless realignments. I remember thinking often that distances did not have to be so formidable and that Lessing needed to be more accessible to the third world or to the inhabitants of Asia. I recall very vividly a short exchange between two women friends at the first International Doris Lessing Conference. Do you think, one remarked, things have changed dramatically since 9/11? Definitely, replied the other. The world has been split irrevocably into pre 9/11 and post 9/11. As a seat dropper, there were no eaves separating us. I was sitting in the chair behind them, and we were a modest group waiting for the new session to begin. Listening to this conversation reminded me of Auden's description of John Keats, the boy with his nose pressed to the sweet shop window, not really being able to eat the sweets, but to being able to see them. Except, of course, Auden and Keats and the sweet shop were no longer around. Keats had been replaced by me, the itinerant fly on the wall, trying to make sense of the sweet shop that had now morphed into this new academic, geographic, geopolitical world. So, to lead us back to that overwhelming pronouncement, did the world really change after 9/11? For many of us who knew little of England and even less of America, we continued to occupy the same old periphery long after 9/11. As it happens, as it happened, papers in full submitted by participants unable to attend were read out in the first international conference in 2004. The organizers of the Doris Lessing Society at the first international conference were large-hearted and sensitive enough to allow an entire paper to be read in the absence of the presenter who couldn't make it from India. There were objections from those assembled, so I'm not sure if the practice was continued. So, yes, perhaps the world continued to harden after 9/11 and became more formidable. I'm offering minutiae from Close Encounters to underline the fact that even in academia, where we value the light and the truth, there has not existed a world without borders and gates uh, and fences. As Lessing scholars and aficionados in India, there were always plenty of primary readings to get through and revise. The fact that there were more bookstores stocking Lessing's fiction helped, and this influx happened after Lessing's fiction became part of undergraduate syllabi at Delhi University and other universities, and reached a crescendo with Lessing's Nobel laureateship in 2007. Delhi University introduced the Golden Notebook in the undergraduate syllabus at the turn of the century and retained it for over a decade. It was a heady period, and classrooms of undergraduate students fell in love with Doris Lessing and felt that she helped them to understand and negotiate their world better, and that she came from a social and political context that was identifiable. The game change that accelerated the DLSSA was the interest that Josna Reje showed in setting up the South Asia chapter when Swati Mitra brought this up for discussion. All this was put in motion a little before COVID. And with COVID having taken over our traveling lives and our teaching spaces, we retreated yet again into the world of fiction, clutching at writers who examined the world they lived in and helped us understand it a little better. As Lessing aficionados, we continue to discuss the enormous significance of her vast body of writing, comprising fiction, non-fiction, short stories, and novels, among others, that drew upon history and fiction to encompass the length and breadth of the 20th century. Born in Imperial Persia at the end of the First World War and raised in southern Rhodesia, Lessing remained the reluctant colonial and witness to the tumultuous events that dominated the 20th century. In the manner true of all good literature, Lessing drew attention to the margins and the periphery, showing us how people got left out or sidelined. There was little doubt in our minds that her legacy and her ideas, her deeply felt and thought through narratives, must be circulated among younger minds. The best way to do this now, with a greater availability of reading material and online PDFs in circulation, was to start a society closer home. As an iconic writer, Lessing needed to be given her due in the Indian subcontinent because she speaks of a world that is very familiar to all of us in terms of our shared histories of class, race, interwoven with the hierarchies of gender and caste, and questions its assumptions. The possibility of reviving Doris Lessing's work for readers in the subcontinent who could find a platform to discuss her work and share their discoveries and make new literary and philosophic connections became more and more urgent. It bore fruition at the end of several international online meetings where many of us tuned in to explore the advantages of online dissemination as well as the paucity of funding. The first online webinar the DLSSA held happened this year in March 2022 on the 25th and the 27th. and it was titled Multicultural Doris Lessing, Lessing through the South Asian Lens. This online seminar was made possible as a result of our collaboration with the Doris Lessing Society under the online aegis of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media, the CSGCM, West Bengal State University, located at Calcutta. Although our first webinar commemorated the month of March, in which Women's Day falls, and the second seminar in October is celebrating Lessing, whose birthday falls in this month, and Lessing is, of course, a woman writer. I would like to stress that the DLSSA is not only women centric, as it remains convinced that the onus to resist patriarchy and create a more egalitarian world lies with both men and women, who will have to ideate and work very hard for the same. Our first webinar kickstarted the activities of the DLSSA and examined the multifaceted world that Lessing's body of work represented. It was an unusual webinar because of participants from different parts of the Asian continent and from America as well, and they were all gathered together in cyberspace. Perhaps this provided a symbolic blueprint for the borderless universe that literature has always been pointing us towards. The DLSSA has also organized reading groups that have had 2 successful meetings and brilliant inputs from participating students. We are also working on putting together the papers presented by participants in the form of an online newsletter. We hope these will provide ample opportunities for the articulation of thought and engaged writing. The smooth running of our programs would not have been possible without the nurturing logistics provided by the CSGCM, West Bengal University. Okay, so on the first day of our seminar, of our webinar, which is called Lessing and Voices from the Margins, the title of the webinar echoes Lessing's anxieties about mainstreams and margins and her concern about people who dropped out of the system because their inputs and their reservations would be so valuable and would help to reboot the mess that we have created around us. As I extend a warm welcome to everyone, I would like to remind all participants about the precarious space available to literature, ideas, and language in these times. Worldwide, we also face the continued push of the state to simplify and thereby erase differences. Such struggle for alpha identities has led now to the exacerbated hierarchies of nations, people, cultures, and languages that we exist in. The DLSSA continues to believe that ideas belong to all of us and travel across innumerable lands where they continue to be received, absorbed, and adapted in the new climes that they arrive at. It is through such commitment that languages breathe and literatures thrive, revitalizing extant thought processes, building links, and remaking cultural practices to transform the world. I now look forward to your continued participation in the DLSSA activities and hope to learn from the exciting new perspectives newer generations will offer. Now I would like to read out a letter from Josna Reje, the president of the Doris Lessing Society, because she couldn't be here in person. So here we go. Greetings to the Doris Lessing Society, South Asia, on the occasion of your second online conference this year. 2022 has been a busy and productive inaugural year for the DLSSA, the first chapter of the Doris Lessing Society, which was founded in the United States back in 1977. First, the organizing meetings and the chapter proposal, then the inaugural webinar back in March, International Women's Month, hosted like this weekend's conference by the Center for Gender, Culture and Media at West Bengal State University. That well attended opening conference generated a lot of excitement, especially since students played such an active role in it. But DLSSA did not rest on its laurels. It held two reading group sessions in which participants discussed a number of Lessing short stories. And now, in Lessing's birth month, comes the second online conference, this time on the theme of Voices from the Margins. Participants include both eminent and upcoming scholars from four countries, two South Asian nations, India and Bangladesh, and 10 different colleges and universities across India. As the current president of the Doris Lessing Society, I am delighted to see such interest, activity, and scholarship. Just two requests from the Doris Lessing Society. One, new members of DLSSA, please do join the Doris Lessing Society as well. You can join for free online from our website, dorislessingsociety.wordpress.com stroke join stroke. And two, students, please consider submitting your work to the Doris Lessing Society's 2022 Student Essay Contest. We invite current and recent postgraduate students and upper level undergraduates to submit an essay of at least 3,000 words on the work of Doris Lessing by 15th December 2022. Professors are invited to nominate essays by current or recent students, or students may submit their work independently. I wish the DLSSA a stimulating and successful conference. I know that after this weekend, once again, DLSSA will not be content to rest on its laurels, but is already planning new activities, scholarly publications, and the active pursuit of new members from all the countries that make up South Asia. I salute you. And that was Josna Reje's message to the DLSSA participants.
Thank you, Ratna.
Yes.
We don't mind being welcomed on both days because there are people here who were not there yesterday. So it's very happy to have them. And so promptly from 6, although this today we begin from 6:30, as we know that in the program we have mentioned that we begin from 6:30, particularly for the valedictory, so that it doesn't come at a very ungodly hour for the person who is going to give the address, which is Robin. It's going to be pretty early for her, which is why we can't wait for 5 more minutes before we kind of
Start. Yes,
begin. Bothania is here,
Hi.
um, and so hi Bothana, and she's traveling, but she's here as well, which
So,
is so nice of her. And maybe, as some of us already know, uh, mm, uh, Professor Asanuzzman, he is having a very bad eye, an infection. So, in case we have some time after his session and after Srijani presents, we might have an open house of sorts for 10 minutes or so where we can just talk among ourselves before the valedictory begins. So that's the plan. Maybe we can ask the core people to join in, and then we can begin.
sounds fine. So, Swati, what happens? You're the compare for today, right?
Uh, I'm the chair for Bothena, and I'm the chair for Robin, and then I think you are there for. Oh, you are the chair for Bothena, aren't you?
Yes, I was
Yes,
just
sure.
going to call
I'm
you.
on.
What is that
Yeah.
thing called?
So you are there.
Right.
I'm the compare for all
The
everything
whole
that
day.
has to be filled in.
All right.
Yeah. So you are the chair for Bothena, and I'm the chair for Robin,
I was
and
just going to
Ujjwal.
add whistle, you, when you
Yeah.
said I'm the chair for
No,
Botena.
no, no, no. I'm not. Although it kind of slipped my mind. But
Yeah,
Srijani has also joined. I'll just check on the program.
sure.
But yes, you are the chair, and Bothena is the first speaker, a special session that we are going to have.
Okay, so you are going to be introducing both of us, is it?
Yeah,
All right, cool.
right. Or is it Chandrabha who was supposed to be the chair or be there or something? But
Who's
I'm going
supposed
to
to be
do.
the chair? I don't know who's supposed to be what. So,
It doesn't matter. I think I will just do this, do
cool.
the needful. Chandrabha did say she's going to join in a little later.
All right.
Right.
So
So
hi.
I'll just wait for a couple of more minutes and then we begin.
Sure.
Both with the chair and the speaker on this very, very special session that we have. Hello, Professor Asanusaman, are you all right? Is the eye better? Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see that people have logged in even before schedule with all their interests. I'm so happy that both a chair and a speaker are here for a very special session with which we begin the second day of the international conference, a webinar um, on dressing and voices from the margin. We in the first session, which is the special session, we have for chair Professor Ratna Raman. Ratna Raman, she is a professor in Sri Venkateshwar College, New Delhi. She has been teaching in English and in translation. She's been teaching literature in English and in translation to undergraduate students for well over 3.5 decades. Currently, she is a professor of English at Sri Venkateshwara College, Delhi University, and she is deeply interested in the 19th century, the 20th century novel, and women's rights and contemporary women's writing. She's also interested in Indian classical literature, theatre, music, and food, culture, travel, and plants. For the last 14 years, she has been engaged in the production of public facing scholarship and have contributed several essays and short stories and articles on contemporary issues to newspapers and news magazines. Her column, Mind Your Language, ran in the Tribune, India's oldest newspaper in English, for 3.5 years from 2014 to 2018. She also has a doctoral in Doris Lessing. May I also add that she has a book among all other publications. She also has a special book on Doris Lessing called Doris Lessing Re Envisioning Feminism, the Fiction of Doris Lessing, published by Bloomsbury 2021. Ratna Raman is also a core member of Doris Lessing Society, South Asia. She's also a member of Doris Lessing Society, like many of us here, and she is going to be our most dynamic chair for the special session with Muthena Major. Over to you, Ratna.
Thank you. So, hello, Buthena. Thank you, Swati, for this glowing introduction. And I don't know if I'm going to be the most dynamic chair. I'm the only chair in this session, remember? so, uh, uh, so I would. Why don't you tell us about Buthena? Why don't you introduce Buthena also, and then we can just start the session?
Ratna,
Yeah,
you're the chair.
I know,
You
but
want me to?
that's
You
what I
want?
asked you.
Oh, so you want me to introduce Buthena?
Yeah, please introduce Buthena, and then we can
No,
just.
you will do the formal introduction. I'll just invite her.
All right.
Right.
Okay.
Because this is a special session where Buthena um, is an extension of the South Asian Doris Lessing Society chapter because she is from Tunisia, who's been very interested and has eagerly participated in the previous webinar that we had in March and has been communicating thereafter, giving us a very valid, very interesting suggestions. And I think we have loads to take from her. Something which we will keep for the open session if we have one, or after her paper, is we might go into some kind of a collaboration with her very shortly. But I would request the chair, Professor Ratna Raman, to go for the formal
Yeah, just
introduction of the speaker.
yes, just 1 second. All right.
Shall I send you the program?
No, I have the program. I'm just opening it. Okay. So the speaker we have with us today is Buthaina Majul, who is from the High Institute of Languages of Tunis, ISLT University of Carthage. And she is going to be speaking about Doris Lessing and Original Mind. And Butena is currently Associate Professor of English Literature at the High Institute of the Languages of Tunis, ISLT, University of Carthage. She holds an MA in cross-cultural poetics at ISLT and a PhD in English literature from Flam University of Manuba. She is certified in digital pedagogy and serves as the coordinator of online teaching and UVT referent as ISLT. She designed and tutored several online courses with the Tunisian Virtual University. She is a member elect of the ISLT. So sorry. This is my, yeah. So, Buthena, as you can see, I'm terrible with technology and just grappling. Okay, right. And I have just lost my BioNote page, and I'm really, really apologetic about this. Uh, sorry. Just 1 minute more. Right. Okay. Bhuthana has more than 22 years of teaching experience. Her areas of specialization are world literature, Maghreban literature, comparative literature, film studies, cultural poetics, social entrepreneurship, emotional intelligence, and digital communication. She published two books, Doris Lessing, Poetics of Being in Time in 2016, The Genetic and Generic Affiliations of Rushdie's Satire in Midnight's Children 2017, edited 3 volumes on trauma and traumatic memory 2017, and Terrorism in Literature, Examining a Global Phenomena in 2019, and Maghreban Voices, Roots, Routes, to be issued in 2021. She has also co-edited 3 volumes on history and memory in Arab literature and Western poetics 2020, Poetics of the Native 2020, and Poetics and Hermeneutics of Pain and Pleasure 2021. She is the author of several academic articles and 5 collections of poems. She delivered presentations in several national and international conferences in Tunisia and other countries, and organized several academic events, conferences, workshops, study days, and webinars. She is a member of the Doris Lessing Society and a member of the scientific committee of the research laboratory, language and cultural forms, ISLT, University of Carthage. She is a member of the steering committee of challenging Charity, a global network, and vice chair of the Global Liberal Arts Network. She is a FICRA ambassador in Tunisia. So, over to you, Buthena Majuli, and looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. And this is such an amazing and versatile profile. And I'm going to apologize again for my incompetence with technology because it's closer to the dinosaurs. It's much closer to the dinosaurs than I had even imagined.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this generous presentation, and you're doing fine. All your presentations are fantastic, and whenever I attend some, I think I attended twice with you, and you chair in a very, very great way the panel. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the generous introduction. I would like to thank Swati for always being that dynamic and inviting me to be part of what you're doing, which is amazing. And I thank my students who are here. Some of them I sent an invitation because I think that they have, this is the new generation. You've mentioned, Professor Ratna, they should read Lessing with a fresh eye, and they should read it bearing in mind what is going on in the world. So when Swati invited me to give this talk, I said to myself, it is very difficult to give tribute to the whole gambit of works of Doris Lessing. And I thought, I always associate Doris Lessing to what she calls original minds. And we hardly need original minds. So I thought that my talk should be about Doris Lessing being an original mind in the way she looks at this idea of margin and center. So I will try to follow this order. Doris Lessing, a chronicle of our time.
listening to and speaking for voices from the margin, speaking for the colonized, for activists and revolutionaries, for refugees, for the invisible, a feminine voice speaking for free women, speaking for the displaced, standing against arms, speaking for the people of the path, speaking for monsters and two monsters in us, speaking for emerging writers, this new generation. A presence we choose to live inside. My title is also the title of Doris Lessing's book. And on Original Minds, sci-fi and Sufi voicing the human in us, bridges, and here a clan to African laughter and stories of a dolorous colonial past and a frustrating post-colonial reality that will lead to prospects, Lessing and Tunisian iconoclasts and the role of the intellectual. And I'll end with Lessing and Johor, the Warner, or the visionary. I am not going to share for screen because I think that Google Meet impedes us from moving the slides. So the chronicler of our time, Doris Lessing is a writer for all seasons. Her multiplex writings resist any generic and thematic categorization. She indeed tackled different genres and ventured into experimenting historical, social, spiritual, and political literary texts. She published more than 40 novels, 17 collections of short stories, two plays, two poetry collections, and two volumes of her autobiography, memoirs, and several articles. In Doris Lessing, The Poetics of Change, Gayle Green claims, no one, I quote, no one had ever spoken to us and of us and for us as Lessing did. Lessing is also called the chronicler of our times. Her novels bore the imprint of her multicultural experiences and enclosed her experimental analysis of the historical events she herself witnessed. She asserts, I quote, I was formed by three main things: Central Africa, the legacy of World War I, and by literature. She is at the same time the child of the East and the daughter of the West. She was born in Persia, Iran, grew in South Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now, and lived in London. These many places and multiplex experiences allowed her to cogitate about the world and embrace its complexity. Her works provided the literary arena with historical records of the two world wars, the spread of communism, and also shed light on the important socio-political conflicts of her time. In fact, as Gallen says, Lessing is tangibly present in all her work, all her characters as both seeker and guide. Her novels are imbued with insightful existential philosophies, and her texts, which are the world within a world, as she says in Time Bites, represent embodiments and disembodiments of historical reflections. At the end of her literary journey, she goes beyond Sufism, which she considers, I quote from Time Bites, beyond religion. Most of whose practices are the ethics of the society in which it operates codified, is a range where experience becomes more complex than the rigidities of good, bad, white, black. She goes towards a philosophy that is all encompassing, embracing humanity at large and not just Westernness. She advocates humanism, and her texts bear universal messages. So listening, this part is the part I call writing the self in a small personal voice and writing the world, and to take from Idris Sheikh, in the world, being in the world, not of it. Listening to, speaking for voices from the margin. The load of cultural background contained in her literary works is the outcome of her multiple and cross-cultural experiences. Indeed, her personal background prepared her for a long struggle against political charms and social injustices. So, speaking for the colonized, she experienced being the daughter of the British Empire, the colonizer, and also defending the rights of the colonized Africans against the hegemonic forces. She remembers her father, who was I quote, never able to reconcile his belief in his country with his anger and the cynicism of its leaders. And the anger, the sense of betrayal, strengthened as he grew old and ill. This taken from a small personal voice. She witnessed his grief, her father's grief, and disembodied pains. I quote, his leg was cut off at mid-thigh and was shell-shocked. He was very ill for many months with a prolonged depression afterward. He spent his life trying to give his family a decent life and trying to climb the rank of the wealthy. In 1925, he moved to South Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, to work and live there. He aimed at becoming a big farmer and landowner. He and his family were part of the colonizers of the Blacks' land. But I quote, it would not have occurred to them that the land belonged to the Blacks. And this is taken from her autobiography, first volume of her autobiography, Under My Skin. They were part of the British Empire that penetrated virgin lands and then claimed civilization was being brought to savages because British Empire was a boon and a benefit to the whole world. End of quote. In The Grass of Singing, Lessing unveils the horrors of colonialism and its impact on people's lives. She describes the social injustices and discrimination she witnessed in Southern Rhodesia. I quote, where democracy was for the white minority and the Black majority had no rights of any kind. And this is taken from prisons. Later, in her activist phase, she recalls childhood memories of colonialism, racism, and imposed social hierarchies, and starts fighting against apartheid. She was then banned from South Rhodesia and South Africa for her revolutionary ideas. Her activism in early life regarding the appropriation and surrender of colonial claims in South Rhodesia, the dissolution of apartheid, and the rise and fall of communism as a viable conduit of social change. This phase of rebellion against post-war and post-colonial packages drove her into communism, which she regrets saying, I have to record what was probably the most neurotic act of my life. I decided to join the Communist Party. And this is at a time when my doubts had become something like a steady private torment. This is from her second volume of autobiography, Walking in the Shade. She joined the party believing that, I quote, and this is from Karl Marx, the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims for the enforcement of the momentary interests in the working class, and this was the idea. She then advocated communism and believed in its capacity to change the world, and she asserts, I was a member of the Communist Party writers group. I attended about 8 or 10 meetings. She adhered to the party at the age of 23, fueled with ambitions and dreams for better conditions of life and equal chances for all. She describes the party members as follows. Some of them were marvelous people, and they tended to be very good at analyzing the problems of their society. But they talked absolute rubbish about international affairs of the Soviet Union. I left the party, this in the 1950s, when everybody else did, as it became evident that the Soviet Union was a very bad place. Later, Lessing discovered that it was all nonsense, mere political trickery. She harshly describes communism. I call it mass psychopathy, because what we believed was rubbish. I had absolutely nothing to do with what was going on it has nothing to do with what was going on in the world. In her disappointment, she contends, I feel I have been part of some mass illusion or delusion. Her political goals are different, for she aims at turning the world into a better place for all, whereas the Communist Party had financial and hegemonic gains. Speaking for refugees, her life taught her to be a rebel. That's what Doris Lessing was. Her parents' misfortune, failed marriages, and disappointment with communism engaged her into a quest for existential truths and a continuous attempt to readjust history. In her book, The Wind Blows Away Our Words, which she dedicates to the gallant people of Afghanistan, She narrates her quite exceptional experience in a refugees camp in Afghanistan, where she met mujahideen with scars from many battles and a finger blown off by a toy bomb, and tackled to oppressed invisible and talked, sorry, to oppressed invisible women with burqa covers from head to foot. She tried to come closer to these mujahideen and grasp their way of thinking, and she deduced their vulnerability by the claim of one commander, I quote, "We cry for your help, but the wind blows away our words." She sarcastically argues, in a world where we can accept as normal between 20 and 80 million people were killed, I suppose 5 million Afghan refugees are hardly worth mentioning. This trivialization of evil reflects a dreary psychological truth, what Hannah Arendt calls the banality of evil. The critic asserts the problem of evil will be the fundamental question of post war intellectual life in Europe, and her claim prophesies the calamitous future to come that we're still witnessing now. Speaking for the invisible, Lessing also attempted to infiltrate inside the world of this kind of geographies of exclusion of Afghan veiled women, which she dolefully described arguing, "It is painful to see a woman who have been talking to a human being, a person transformed this way." This encounter affected and intrigued her. A woman in a burqa, interestingly, has a more free casual walk than one who is veiled. She thus curiously tried to experience this invisibility in order to better understand the situation of these oppressed women. I quote, "When I was back in London, I wrapped my head in a veil covering my mouth and my forehead down to the eyebrows. Only my eyes were showing. I went out about the streets like this for a day. I had become invisible. Having taken in with the glance in my statement, I don't want to be looked at. People's eyes slid over and past me. They do not let their eyes engage with yours. Soon I realized that my eyes were trying to make themselves be noticed. In a Muslim country, they would be empathetically made up. I realize now how usually in buses, on the underground, passing someone on the pavement, I rely on my face to convey messages with a smile or a look, but now smiles were invisible, mouth hidden. When a mouth is covered up, you become very conscious of it. Soon it seems something forbidden or unpleasant or shameful, something erotic that must be concealed, even a wound. Experiencing invisibility compels her to question social constructs, religious dogmas, and human psychological complexities. She ponders on how the Afghan women, amongst other women in the world, accept to imprison themselves inside this cocooned world of an existence. She also criticizes fallacious religious interpretations, nowhere mentioned in the Quran or by the Prophet. I'm quoting from her book, The Wind, and which are advocated to alienate women and deprive them from their rights. She insists on the misreading of the religious texts as historical documents, claiming, I quote, "Why do we have to worry about what was said so many centuries ago? Obviously, there was something in the mechanism of the human mind that demands it." Though Lessing directs harsh criticism towards the subjugation of Afghan women, she counterattacks this religious alienation, asserting liberal Muslims say there are plenty of texts in the Quran on which the equality of women can be established for a reform of Islam. For instance, women are the twins halves of men's. Paradise is under the feet of the mother. What is a woman's property must not be taken from her. It is on this last text that already Muslims are establishing themselves as businesswomen. It helps too that Muhammad's first wife was a successful trader in her own right. I'm quoting from The Wind Blows Away Our Words. This account of Afghan resistance aimed at speaking out for a population whose fate is to be condemned with the contentious fight against Western hegemony, national oblivion, and personal traumas. Venturing to enter such dangerous spaces taught her that, between inverted commas, this is a quote, what we read in newspapers was not mirrored in the people we met and in the life we experienced, end of quote. And thus, there is an incessant need to question and experience history to reach the truth about the past. She suggests that everything should be re examined and rethought, for what is reported could be fallacious or mere imposed personal interpretation of facts. The writer bitterly claims, I quote, "It was horrible, moving around among these people with nothing to give them except the promise to publicize their situations. Sorry. This journey helped her penetrate under the skin of these people and experiment their lives and thus investigate hidden facets of history." So I think I read these, sorry. So feminine voice speaking for free women, and I'm at the same time suggesting some readings. And here is the cover of Professor Ratna Raman's book. The novelist uses her protagonists to rebel against social constructs. Her female characters are free women in quest for social recognition and for detachment from female hegemony. Her characters are original minds who do not fit the preconceived social norms. The writer expresses a clear view on the equality of men and women in order to stop the feminist criticism. She simply explained that the gender dichotomy should be reconsidered in terms of different but equal individuals, as she puts it. Of course, I am for women's equality. Of course, I consider women inherently equal to men. However, I would never maintain that men and women are alike. They simply are not. Physically, psychologically, and intellectually, they are not, which is not to say that women must be more stupid than men. They have other gifts. No two people in the world are perfectly alike. How can men and women be alike? What I wish is that women should be independent, neither the slaves of men nor Amazons. And here an interesting book by Doris Lessing, I should have mentioned it, which is The Cleft, where she invented the universe where men when baby boys are killed, and it's an all women universe. And it's really questionable what she meant by that work. Speaking for the displaced, Mrs. Lessing has lived her whole life as an exile, being exiled from her beloved Africa, her difficult parents, her children, says Herman. When she visited the refugees camp in Afghanistan, she became nostalgic of her birthplace, Persia, and reports it in the book The Wind Blows Away Our Words. "I was born in Persia and lived there until I was 5. Yes, all kinds of scents and sounds came back." One exile told her he had been warned about her by the British Secret Services. They asserted that she was involved in dangerous conspiracy with the Arabs. That was such a joke. I wasn't. She was also classed as prohibited immigrant in Rhodesia. So despite now being one of literature's most respected figures, she knows all about being considered apolitical and desirable. The writer also experienced being rejected and ejected from Zimbabwe because of her political ideologies. She often felt she was a homeless foreigner, both in London, a country that proved to be different from her mother's stories, as well as in Africa, from which she was exiled and to which she returned back years after to feel more nostalgic and more estranged than ever. She was thus, as Julia Kristiva puts it, not belonging to any place, any time, any love, a lost origin, the impossibility to take root, a ramaging memory. This is taken from Strangers to Ourselves. Lessing experienced dislocation and felt for a while as a foreigner and even a prohibited immigrant, as she bitterly narrates it in her African Laughter 4 visits to Zimbabwe. I should move to this one. I was already a prohibited immigrant in 1956, but did not know it. It never crossed my mind I could be. The impossibility was a psychological fact, nothing to do with the daylight realities. You cannot be forbidden the land you grew up in, so says the web of sensations, memories, experience that binds you to that landscape. Lessing, the foreigner, finds a home in her memories. She recalls them, historicizes them in her books, and then familiarizes with the strange places through her exorcised, fictitious worlds. She stood against arms and nuclear weapons, and these are pictures taken. I kept the copyright on them. These pictures are taken from ban the bomb demonstration at Trafalgar Square in '61. Her revolutionary actions also include her engagement into massive campaign for nuclear disarmament. She explains in her article entitled "Those Shores of Sweet Unreason." I have in the last year been in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Holland, Austria, France, and in 5 cities in Germany. I did not go. Meaning to get involved with the matter of nuclear war, but this was what happened. I was enabled to gain an overall view of the various kinds of nuclear disarmer and similar people. It must be the most astonishing mass movement in recent times. Looking at the horrors caused by armament, she attempts pragmatism and argues, I do not think that war is inevitable, only that it is probable. The economy of the whole world is based on weapon making, and she is convinced that to get rid of nuclear weapons means to change the world's economy. Lessing points fingers of blame on politicians who wage war in order to earn financial gains, in utter indifference about human tragic losses. She ironically suggests, why not revive the old custom of hostages? Nations liable to attack each other exchanged of the sons of kings to be educated in others' courts. It worked. So her engagement in the campaign for nuclear disarmament bears utopian ideologies. Yet she claims utopian. To my mind, it is no more utopian than deciding we can abolish nuclear weapons in time to stop ourselves being blown up by them and resting all our hopes on that. She blames the political leaders for their wrong, destructive decisions, and also indirectly accuses people's silence, oblivion, and frailty. She thinks that the whole political system is entrapped within the vicious circle of such dominant ideologies. She asks one ironic question. Why is that our leaders and politicians are so much silly and less competent than the people they lead? Throughout her lifetime experiences, she discovers that power is ephemeral and that the political hegemonic forces need to look back in time to read history and realize that all their powerful ideologies would certainly vanish. Lessing says it clearly in an interview. When you look at my life, you can go back in the late 30s. What I saw, first of all, Hitler was going to live forever. Mussolini was in for 10,000 years. You have the Soviet Union, which was by definition going to last forever. There was the British Empire. Nobody imagined it could come to an end. So why should one believe in any kind of permanence? Am I reaching? Yeah, speaking for the people of the past. The historical events she witnessed and the many experiences she went through were accentuated by her meeting with the Iranian scholar and writer Idris Sheikh in the mid-60s. He changed her vision of life and her way of reading and writing literature. This encounter reshaped her being and metamorphosed her texts. Sheikh showed her the way towards truth and transported her into the labyrinth of the soul. Meeting the scholar led her to explore Sufi literature and find in it what she was looking for after having exhausted all the Western ways and allays. She explained that that what compelled her to look elsewhere for existential truths was a feeling that the kind of education most of us is not giving us information we ought to have. She thus asserts in her article on Sufism and Idris Sheikh, the commandant self, I had reached the end of some road and knew it. Specifically, I had exhausted what I have described as the intellectual package of our time, which consists of material, both philosophic, and that assumption of our culture that creature comforts must be everyone's chief aim in life. Then belief in one of the churches of Marxism, a belief that politics or a political party will solve everything, science in the place of God. I was by no means the only one to have who was tired of this package. In my case, it was right in the Golden Notebook book that taught me I must look again. She reads Idris Sheh's work and starts a new epistemological and philosophical journey into the recesses of the soul, as she realizes that understanding the outer world requires an in-depth exploration of the soul. The Sufi scholar Al-Ghazali, in The Alchemy of Happiness, explains that the way to happiness is first real self-knowledge, and asserts that real self-knowledge consists in knowing the following things. What art thou in thyself, and from whence hast thou come? Whither art thou going, and for what purpose hast thou come to tarry here a while, and in what does that thy real happiness and misery consist? The writer, being a reader of Sufi writings, becomes aware of the compulsion of a quest for essence and self-knowledge. And then she had to speak for monsters, between inverted commas, to the monsters in us. Doris Lessing created Ben Lovett, to point fingers of blame towards modern societies that reject any kind of difference. Harriet's mother, Dorothy, proclaims that society might think of people like Ben, her son Ben. He may be normal for what he is, but he is not normal for what we are. This is a quote from The Fifth Child. In the novel's sequel, Ben in the World, Ben committed suicide after losing any hope of conforming to the social norms or finding people like him. Lessing explains in an interview, I quote, "You know, that child isn't evil at all. He's just out of the right place. If he is in fact the result of a gene which has come down through many centuries, all he is a different race of being that's landed up in our somewhat complicated society." So the real monster is the society we live in that puts standards and norms and abides by them and excludes. It's a society of exclusion, anything that is different from it. Speaking for emerging writers, another kind of people from the margin, the writer uses a pseudonym to make a little experiment, the pseudonym of Jane Somers. And as she puts this in the preface of the Diaries of Jane Somers, I wanted to cheer up young writers who often have such a hard time of it by illustrating that certain attitudes and processes they have to submit to are mechanical and have nothing to do with them personally or with them their kind of degree of talent. And of course, you should know the story of Jane Somers. She published three books, I think. The diary, I am going to mention them: The Diary of Jane Somers, A Good Neighbor, and If the Old Could. And they were written under the name of Jane Somers, and they were refused by some publishers because it was not Doris Lessing. So it's just to show that the publishing industry, it has nothing to do with whether you have a talent or not, but they care about books that sell. Prisons we choose to live inside. Lydia Vanu classifies Doris Lessing in her book, The Desperado Age, as a desperado writer, the desperado writer that creates the challenging text. Writing stands for liberating the self from all kinds of prisons we choose to live inside, an invitation to liberate ourselves from any social molding or indoctrination, and to discover our uniqueness and to open to the world with a specific focus on how, and here I would like to talk about her, how she empowers and inspires through her texts. Lessing thinks we live in a series of prisons called race, class, male and female. There always, and there is always those classifications. She is an original mind. She is against all forms of prisons, yet all forms of societal constraints and constructs. She hates being brainwashed by educational systems. She's against violence, against fundamentalism, against capitalism, against group minds, against all forms of discrimination and political hegemonies, all labels we might put on people all social etiquette, and I think she refused a very important prize from the British monarchy or something like that. She is against mental institutions. She refuses differences, as I mentioned in Ben in the World and its sequel, The Fifth Child. It's the opposite. Against all forms of social hypocrisies and social institution. For example, she always says that marriage was not one of her talents. Okay, and she's against socially constructed roles. And this is something that is discussable in Summer Before the Dark. She was working on what Foucault calls technology of the self, reflection on modes of living, on choices of existence, on the way to regulate one's behavior, to attach oneself to ends and means. End of quote. She moved towards humanistic, cosmopolitan self, open to other, because she is an original mind. What society blames, Lessing celebrates. In The Politics of Experience, the British psychiatrist Lang describes how, in some instances, breakdown becomes breakthrough, transforming the schizophrenic experience into a transcendental experience, and that the voyage is not what we need to be cured of, but that it is itself a natural way of healing our own appalling state of alienation called normality. Lessing sees madness, for example, as a rather enriching experience. She thinks that the mentally ill represent, in fact, an original mind, a lonesome individualist who overturns conformity, transcends the preconceived conventions of group minds, and experiments a different layer of being. Being herself an original mind, and don't mistake this word with being mad, but being special, she decides to embark into this idea of pseudonyms, writing, and publishes two works, the diaries of Jane Somers and If the Old Could, under the name of Jane Somers. And this experience put her into the skin of writers who face the difficulties. This is to encourage them to become themselves original minds, to test her capacity. It was meant to test her capacity towards writing differently, and her readers and viewers' literary flair of guessing her style and distinguishing it from other types. Okay, so it was taking being an original mind and being away from this fame and recognition world she was in. Lessing exercises her traumas in her writings. When she looks back at her lifetime experiences, war, dislocation, feminism, communism, Jane Somers, madness, and writing, she declares in a joke, I often feel like a dinosaur. Her literature is not the outcome of her academic background, for she left school at the age of 14. As she explains it in an interview, I didn't go to school much, so I taught myself what I knew from reading. She often says that the best university or school is a good library. Her works are rather the reward of her readings and multiple and complex experiences. And her reading led her to the Sufi phase and her space fiction narratives and so on. So in an attempt to voice the human in us. In the midst of her despair and socio-political disillusionment, she finds sanctum in Sufism. She finds in Sufi thoughts answers that neither science nor psychoanalysis nor religion could provide. She explains, as for people like myself, unable to admire organized religions of any kind, then philosophy shows where to look for answers to questions put by society and by experience, questions not answered by the official purveyors of knowledge, secular or sacred. And this is taken from An Ancient Way to New Freedom. She emphasizes the fact that Sufism showed her the right way to grasp the truth and understand the world around her. She claims the most useful thing I personally have been invited to do in my own approach towards Sufi study is to find out why you believe the things you do believe, examine the basis of your ideas. Lessing also draws on the work of the Persian theologian and Sufi mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, which inspired her poems and novels alike. In fact, there are the vestiges of the enigmatic thoughts of the poet and the obvious traces of his metaphoric style and symbolism in her texts and poetry. Poetry is the other way of excavating the secret of the soul. Rumi narrates his quest for essence, existential inquiries, and reaching the truth in a poem. I'm not of nature's meant, not of the circling heaven. I'm not of the earth, nor of water, nor of air, nor of fire. I'm not of the empyrean, nor of the dust, nor of existence, nor of entity. I am not of this world, nor of the next, nor of paradise, nor of hell. I'm not of Adam, nor of Eve, nor of Eden and Rizwan. My place is the placeless, my trace is the traceless. Tis neither body nor soul, for I belong to the soul of the beloved. And you will see a lot of Rumi's imprints in her descent for briefing for a descent into hell, an amazing novel by Doris Lessing. So, bridge, let me call this part a bridge, African laughter and stories between a dolorous colonial past and a frustrating post-colonial reality. In African stories, she sheds light on manifestations of race prejudice in Africa. And in African Laughter, the novelist recalls back her childhood memories in South Rhodesia. She returns to her homeland after having been exiled for so long. She claims you cannot be forbidden the land you grow up, so she cannot accept this. And the book encloses her nostalgia for Zimbabwe, her criticism of the colonial ideologies and the post-colonial politics and policies of the country. Her four visits to Africa represent a kind of reconciliation with her past. These even deepened her bond to the land and strengthened her political implication with the past, present, and future of Zimbabwe. This racist divide still exists in the African society and the Afrikaner's mind, but the situation of some white, they are changed. Lessing explains, nothing is more satisfying to the ironies of history nerve than to watch those whites who stay in Zimbabwe but preserve their feelings of superiority, filling their plates with zadza. Then, in old days, zadza was kafir food and no white would dream of eating it. Separatism is in the minds, is in the midst, but is no longer seen in the style of life of Black and white Africans. In fact, there is a new rich class of Black people, I'm quoting her, called the chiefs, which emerged after the war, and there are people who imitate the life of white people by watching American soap operas such as Dallas and Dynasty and getting dressed like white people. And at the same time, poverty is still haunting communal parts of the country. Lessing goes around Zimbabwe and dreams to see the laughter of poor people. That's why it's called the African laughter. She returns back to Africa many years after having been prohibited immigrant to find that though colonialism and apartheid are over, yet Africans are still plagued with oblivion and suffer from ignorance and poverty. She claims in an interview, the Africans are fed lies day and night. That's why she was prohibited. Every African township has police spies and government informers. A great section of the African population is corrupt, bought off. The Black worker, especially the miner, lives in the amounts to concentration camp. He's policed, doctored, fed, watched. He hasn't got freedom. He's well fed by African standards, but he's a slave. South Africa is a fascist paradise. It's one of the most brilliant police states in history. In African stories, she blames the colonizers' blindness on the damage they caused in Africa and elsewhere. So it's inside and outside. She's pointing fingers of blame inside and outside, means the colonizer and the colonized. If people had been prepared to listen 2 decades earlier to the small but shrill enough voices crying out for world's attention, perhaps the present suffering in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia could have been prevented. Britain, who is responsible, became conscious of her responsibility too late. And now the tragedy must play itself slowly out. Meanwhile, there are dozens of novels, stories, plays about what one happy reviewer calls the color war. She also refers to the role of the intellectual of the region. Writers brought up in Africa, I'm quoting from African stories, writers brought up in Africa have many advantages, being at the center of a modern battlefield, part of a society in rapid dramatic change. But in the long run, it can also be a handicap. to wake up every morning with one eye on a fresh evidence of inhumanity, to be reminded 20 times a day of injustice, and always the same brand of it can be limiting. And here I move to this part, which is prospects, less in Tunisian iconoclast, relating her work to that of Tunisian intellectuals, and shedding light on the general role, the important role of the intellectual. A writer, any writer, is marginalized, whether by blindness or deafness towards their works and words, or via persecution, as mentioned before in this paper about Doris Lessing being tracked by the CIA and being prohibited immigrant, anyone who speaks out the truth. Lessing's activism, revolutionary ideas, and original mind recalls the Tunisian Maghrebian iconoclasts who resist conformity and transcend the norms of writing to entertain. They rather write to resist all forms of socio-political molding and speak out for the unheard voices of the subjugated. Her objective examination of colonialism in novels and articles is similar to the works of the French Tunisian writer Albert Memmi and his groundbreaking book, The Colonizer and the Colonized. Her resistance to social conformism and acceptance of cultural and educational brainwashing is similar to the way the Moroccan historian, novelist, and philosopher Abdallah Al-Arwi regards alienation and defines it as being molded by culture in his book, The Crisis of the Arab Intellectual. According to him, I quote, "For all objective observers, the true alienation is this loss of self in the absolutes of language, culture, and the saga of the past," end of quote. Her Sufi phase is similar to that of Abdel Wahab, the Tunisian writer Abdel Wahab Midb, and he's digging into Ibn al-Arabi's works, looking for an ultimate existential truth after having examined all ailments of society in his works. That quest within the self was a necessary journey for both intellectuals to grasp the essence of the world. Her works, as well as those of Maghrebian iconoclasts, aim at reconceptualizing the human, as Professor Omri from Oxford University says, and calling for a more inclusive world of social justice and freedom. Johor the Warner, as you know, is one of the Lessing's character in Shikasta, the visionary. Let's just shed light on the fact that she foresaw terrorism and religious tyranny being the future of the world, and religious dictatorship, as well as she mentions that the future will witness, I think she wrote this in the 80s, as we will witness a descent into barbarism. And here we are. Lessing contends that we are living in a lunatic asylum, that our minds are more and more set into attitudes of foreboding and depression. And she adds, pain is becoming our deepest reality. I quote from prison, "This is a time when it is frightening to be alive, when it is hard to think of human beings as rational creatures. Everywhere we look, we see brutality, stupidity, until it seems that there is nothing else to be seen but that, a descent into barbarism, everywhere, which we are unable to check. But I think that while it is true there is a general worsening, it is precisely because things are so frightening, we become hypnotized and do not notice, or if we notice, belittle, equally strong forces on the other side, the forces, in short, of reason, sanity, and civilization." She thinks that a wordsmith should experience a certain proximity with a society in order to be able to narrate its ills. And she is convinced that it is the responsibility of writers to reveal the silent inner voice of society. She argues, in my opinion, it is obvious the job of writers, if they take their profession seriously, to place their fingers on the wounds of our times. She claims our function as writers, I maintain, is to express what other people feel. She blames human beings for this chaos and warns about the indifference. She asserts our minds have been set in the apocalyptic mode, also true, still true. And hegemonic political forces have to become aware of the pandemonium in which human beings are descending. I quote, "I have long recognized that salvation of this world cannot lie in any political ideology. All ideologies are deceptive and serve only a few, not people in general." Lessing claims that literature is one of the most useful ways we have of achieving this other eye, this detached manner of seeing ourselves. And in Sufism, in the novels of Doris Lessing, Galen claims Lessing has made use of Sufi ideas to enhance her own perception of human beings on Earth and on other planets, in life and in afterlife. And I think that she played the role of the writer into the she highlights the role of the writer in and turning it into a humanitarian historiographer. And here she puts history and literature on the same shelf. And I will end by this quote: literature and history, these two great branches of learning, records of human behavior, human thought, are less and less valued by the young and by educators too. Yet from them, one may learn how to be a citizen and a human being. We may learn how to look at ourselves and at society we live in that calm, cool, critical, and skeptical way in which the only possible stands for a civilized human being, or so have said all philosophers and the sages. Thank you, and I hope it was not that long. Thank you for your attention.
Uh, Thank you, Buthaina, for this really lovely, comprehensive, extensive narrative. And as a matter of fact, I was so dazzled listening to what you had to say. It was like, quickly looking through the entire span of Lessing's writing. And I was looking at the time and saying, at what point do I interrupt her so that we don't lose out on all these amazing slides and the information that you shared with us. And thank you also for displaying my book, because I'm sure there are far more fabulous treatises on Lessing and her work. So I enjoyed immensely what you had to say, and thank you for this enormous overview. And there were so many fascinating points that you brought out. I mean, what I found most exciting was your putting up of Tunisian writers whom you called Lessing iconoclasts. And I thought that was very interesting, because we are trying to connect and see where these narratives are taking us and what we are doing. In terms of multiculturalism, what we are doing in terms of people who are speaking from the margins. The other very fascinating thing that you talked about, and this had to do with Lessing and the Whale. And I thought I would bring it up for discussion or for a conversation, or simply to make this point, because today is probably the 42nd day of the protests in Iran, where women are talking about being treated very, very shabbily, and where you have this whole attempt to monitor how they wear their hair or what they do with their veil, or so on and so on and so forth. And I found very interesting this particular comment that Lessing makes when she talks about veiling herself and walking, and the conclusions that she comes to at the end of it, because she's trying to understand what it is like to be a woman who has to wear the hijab, for instance. So my question to you is, Lessing in The Summer Before the Dark gives us Kate Brown. And here is Kate Brown, who is also participating in this journey of, you're smiling already, Bhutina. So, I mean, you already have the answer to this question. You have Kate Brown, who's this really amazing woman. I mean, what a spectacular role model, well-versed in languages, husband who falls in love with her, all kinds of academic achievements, capable of doing tremendous things, has a large family, then decides that she must get her act together, and out she goes and gets a job. And this is every woman who stepped out of a career sort of dream. And then she goes, and what is it that happens to her through this journey? She falls ill, and she's discovering herself, and she doesn't have the household schedules to participate in, and she comes back. And how do we know that she's changed? How do you know that she's transformed? She stops dyeing her hair. So instead of this amazing red, almost mane that she has, she decides to not do her hair at all. So when we are talking about becoming invisible, there's this whole section in the narrative where Kate Brown is on the street, where she is projecting herself in a particular manner, talking about the DNA coding, talking about sexual attraction, what triggers men, and so on and so forth. And I thought it was a wonderful spoof and a very sharp comment on how women are perceived as visible in Western society and how they become invisible. So, what they wear, how they do their hair. I mean, this is, it always used to boggle my mind when I, saw all these comics. Women were forever at the hairdressers doing amazing things to their hair. And so you begin to understand this whole notion of public presentation. And I thought Lessing did that really brilliantly. But I'm a little troubled when she says the smile or the absence of it is what makes you invisible, and she speaks about it as a restriction, because this is really where the debate is. So who decides, who makes these choices? Is it always the culture or the religious control that that is pushing you to do something because something is in the Quran or because something is not in the Quran? Does that really have to be the way we make these choices? Do we make these choices because the liberal state decides that this will work and this will not work? And I'm raising these questions about how women dress and what women wear and what they should wear or should not wear, because these are now becoming very ugly platforms on across nations. It's not just happening in France or in Iran, it's happening in India as well, because yeah. And so I was just thinking, you spoke about this whole space where, Blessing refines the writer as someone who keeps their fingers who's able to place their finger on the wound. And, this is a sort of suppurating wound that we have. So would you like to respond to that?
Thank you so much. I think that you've asked so many questions in just one, means that you took us into different universes. Because let me just say something. Her experiment with the burqa was just to try to understand, to penetrate the mind, the brain of these women, the state of mind of these women. How do they accept the way they accept wearing the burqa? It's not the veil. The veil is just the head. The burqa is you do not even see the eye. It's just a kind of small window, and you see nothing at all in Afghanistan. But I think that what was funny in that book is that she says that these women were experiencing a kind of freedom because they penetrated others' bodies with their eyes and no one notices this. So there was some kind of freedom. So maybe, I don't know if I'm misreading this, but I felt like it's part of their life to be like this, but this allowed them to be to be free, to be more free than those who are not wearing the burqa. So maybe it has become a kind of comfortable situation for these women to go wherever they want and to do whatever they want, and no one will notice them. So this invisibility could have two different facets, and I think that it's one way of saying it depends on how one culture considers calls what for example, the Westerners might think this is invisibility in the sense of disappearing as a woman and not having your rights of being beautiful, of being of showing your beauty and so on. And in another culture, this is called freedom, because you go wherever you want and no one knows. You can do whatever you want and no one will notice you, and you are penetrating other people's bodies. So this is what she tried to do, and it is in that sense that her works are empowering, is that it also makes us think why in the name of religion some people lose their rights, or it's not their rights, it's their choice. Maybe there are women who wear the veil, for example, it's their choice and it's fine, that beyond any religious claim. But then you referred to Kate Brown. I read The Summer Before the Dark twice. I read it years ago, and then they went back to that book. And I don't know, because when you read it at a certain age, you think it's a feminist text about liberating women. But then later on, when the children grow up and you see them going and you see your life going in a similar direction sometimes, and you feel that loneliness and so on, I'd say that Doris Lessing brought that to relate to the statement of Nietzsche, which is human, all too human. That's the cycle of life. That's the cycle of life for a woman. That's the way we should We should see and we should accept that there are phases. We go through phases in life, and not dyeing the hair maybe also is one way of accepting of reaching a certain age, and accepting that this is part of the cycle of life, and not being aware of what is going on, and being yourself, so that being at ease with your body as a woman. So I don't know if I misread this, but I should go back and read it again. I remember that Kate Brown, I had Kate Brown for a while in my head as a woman. And I felt like Doris Lesson excluded the reader for a moment, and she was into Kate Brown's shoes, thinking about all those stories she went through, all those decisions she took, or those choices, let me call them, she made. So yes, it's a feminine, rather feminist experience, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. And I also think that the Summer Before the Dark is also a text that is, recording very astutely, very shrewdly when the shutdown happens for women of a particular age, women of uncertain age. So this is happening in the press, this is happening in narratives, this is happening in private lives, this is happening on the shelves of desire, this is happening on the shelves of achievement, it's also happening in terms of physical appearance. So I think she does that very, very cleverly. She does that very, very brilliantly. So I found that very fascinating. And, this is not really a question, and I'm just going to throw this open to everybody else, but I just wanted to say that it's quite amazing that she's so eclectic in the journeys that she makes. And then she's, sort of doing checkmate before you can say anything to her. So the last piece you read spoke about this is what the sages and philosophers have said. But she's been shouting for much longer. She starts by saying, I don't want to be seen as a wise old woman. And then she says, I believe we were all put here for a purpose. So it's just an extraordinary flowering, or it's that open, it's exhilarating feeling that some of her writing and some of her thought processes leave us with. Okay, so I'm sorry to have hogged this conversation all by myself, and Bhuthena Maju's paper is great. Questions. Yeah, anybody who would like to ask her a question, respond. There's some amazing responses to your paper, which you could look at the message section. But anybody with questions? Yes, Emma, did you want to speak? Yeah, please go ahead. How do we get him to get Dr. Azanus? Yeah, how do we get him to speak? Swati, SOS.
Yeah. No. I think he's speaking. Yes.
Bhuthenia, thank you very much for the wonderful paper and presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, I'm not that well today, and I just want to know from you sort of a clarification. That is, Doris Liskin mentioned that, referring to Quran, that the paradise is under mother's feet. Has she alluded to the Quran or the Hadith?
It was lagging. What is the question? Sorry.
Well, you mentioned that Lessing mentioned in one of the books or works that the paradise lies under mother's feet, right? Did she refer to Holy Quran or to some other sources?
In the statement that I have mentioned, is that the quote that I read, she's mentioning to the religion, the Muslim religion, okay? Because since she really went to, and she mentions even the Muslim religion in The Wind Blows Away, our words, and when she talks about the prophet's love for cats, and how he cared about animals and so on. There are a lot of religious references and from the Hadith and from the Quran, and I think this is part of her Sufi formation because she read about Muslims and Islam. And what she wanted to say is that she's questioning how could people subjugate women, means that Muslim people, maybe this is what she meant, while they know that in the Quran the woman was cherished and the woman was respected, and there are several examples being. So she's putting, means that she's trying to underline this issue of subjugating women. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I think that um, she tried to understand that during her visit to that refugees camp, um, a whole society, a whole mindset, and the way they considered religion, the way they misread even a religion. She's trying to understand what was going on. And what is funny is that this book was, I think that they do not, generally, that book is not mentioned by Doris Lessing. And she herself mentioned inside the book that whenever she was invited and she wanted to talk about it when she published it, they say to her, and I think it was ironic, the fact that you mentioned that. They say to her, please, could you talk about the Golden Notebook? Means that, could we go back to the Golden Notebook? That means that in order to avoid the wind blows away our words. So I think that there is a lot in that book, and I invite you to read it because, yes, she tries to understand how we misread our religious texts and how we use sometimes religion, there is the tendency to use religion to subjugate people. I don't know if I answered your question.
So thank you.
So, okay. Thank you, Dr. Asaduzaman. Uh, yes, I agree completely with you, Manuel Tassi. So, Butena, I'm being signaled that the time for our session is almost over. Swati, is that right? I'm waiting for you to nod one way or the other. Okay. So, thank you so much for this delightful, first session. And I'm now going to hand the mic over to Swati again.
Yeah, thank you, Ratna, and thank you, Bhuthana. That was such I don't know, humongous paper, putting it all together. Uh, a person who kept writing, and you kept and you put it all together. And I was just as a tagline, the you use the word the original thinker. I was also thinking almost that she, in the first book, she also says that it is by the failures and misfits of a civilization that one can best judge its weaknesses, and perhaps by the original minds we see its greatnesses. So with that, we call this very special session to an end. And I would request Ujaljit, Ujaljit Kaur, no, Ujaljit, and our speaker for the evening, Professor Ahmed Hassan Zaman. Ujjal is here, and Professor Ujjaljit is going to chair the session that will be presented by Professor Hassan Zaman.
Thank you so much, Swati. I welcome you all to business session third. And in this session, we have a paper by Professor Ahmed Ehsanuzaman. The title of the paper is Creating Their Own Home, Reading Tagore's The Wife's Letter Through Lessons to Room 19. Ahmed Ehsanuzaman is a professor at the Department of English and Modern Languages, School of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, Independent University, Bangladesh. He was professor at Khulna University until September 30, 2019, when he served as Dean Arts and Humanities School, as head of English discipline, and as director Fine Arts Institute and director IQAC as well. He has an MA in English Literature from Dhaka University and an MPhil and a PhD in Ibsen Studies from Oslo University, Norway. He has researched and published widely on the works of Ibsen, Beckett, Rabindranath Tagore, the father of Bengali nation, I'm sorry, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and Jhumpa Lahiri. His book, Translation Studies Exploring Identities, co edited with Professor Fakhrul Alam, was published by Writers Inc. in 2015. He translated and directed Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, Ganashatru, in 2006 and directed A Doll's House, Ninad, and Shakespeare's Hamlet, respectively, in 2017 and 2018. He collaborated with West Bengal Theatre's Abanti Chakrabarti on a short film based on Shakespeare's play, A Midnight Tempest, which premiered in September 2021. Professor Ehsanuzaman takes an active interest in theatre and performance and has translated Fernando Arabel's The Two Executioners and adapted Bertolt Brecht's Exception and the Rule, which were produced by the state owned Bangladesh Television in its critically acclaimed Biswa Natak World Drama Program in the 1990s. So, this was a very impressive bio note of Professor Ehsanuzaman. I call upon you, sir, to come and present your paper, please.
Um, Thank you very much, Dr. Ujjalji, for the generous introduction. Um, well, I don't have a paper because I'm not that well, and the fact is that the writing of a paper was kind of a last minute call, and Soti in fact requested me to sort of fill in the gap because we wouldn't have many papers uh, on the printing day that's today, and also she wanted sort of a representation from Bangladesh, and that's what I'm doing, sort of gap filling. But I wish I could prepare well for this wonderful webinar. And once again, I would like to thank Bhuthania. That was so wonderful. It was delightful, absorbing, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I've learned quite a lot from the paper. Thank you once again, Bhuthania. The title of my paper, or let me put in different way, the paper that I would be writing soon is creating their own home, reading Tagore's The Wife's Letter through Lessings to Room 19. Uh, well, um, we could also say that is it's sort of a rereading of Tagore through Lessing. That's what I did perhaps because I read I had read this, to Room 19 long time ago, probably some 12 or 13 years back. And then I read it again uh, a week ago or so. And I thought that there could be an interesting connection which I can try to explore. That is how Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel-winning Bengali poet and author, can be reinterpreted or through the story to Room 19. I'm not quite sure whether Lessing read the story because, of course, she knew about Tagore, but whether she had read the story, I'm not quite sure. Maybe Ratna or some other here can shed light on that. But it's a fascinating story. The story, the wife's letter, is fascinating. It was published in 1914 in a celebrated Bengali journal, Shobuj Potro. In English, it should be Green Leaves. And you know, the story features a woman, a married woman, whose name is Minal, meaning lotus in English. And the story is written in epistolary form, that is a letter. And the wife is writing this letter from Srikhetro, which is in Puri, sort of a holy place. And usually widows would settle there. So Minal writes this letter to her husband, and she begins the letter, that is, the address is my revered husband. So that's how she begins the story. And she says, she makes it quite clear that she has come to Srikhetro, and she would settle here permanently. And she provides reasons why she has come up with this decision. She says that apparently they were a happy couple, that is, she had everything. She didn't have the lack of clothing, food, things like that. But she also says that I have never been treated with the with respect which an individual needs from others. And her complaint is against her husband because he was not quite attentive to her desires and needs. And then she brings in the story of one Bindu. Bindu is the daughter of her sister-in-law. And since she didn't have anywhere to go, she came to live with a sister. The sister is a what you call traditional sister-in-law, is a traditional Bengali woman, wife, and she is quite hesitant about Bindu. So Bindu is only 14 when the narrator informs us when she came to live with them. So what happens in course of the story is that Bindu is severely treated. That is, she is orphaned, and since she doesn't have anywhere to go, she is seen as a burden. And Mina's husband is a kind of a jamindar landlord, so he also doesn't want to, want Bindu to live with them, but he cannot just tell her that because Minal has taken an interest in Bindu. And what happens in the story, Bindu could share everything with Minal, and Minal could also share her thoughts, ideas with her. So they form a friendship. And Minal says, the wife says in the letter, that I have I have the moments of intensity with with her, and that in those intense moments I have never enjoyed with anyone else. But since she is a burden, so she has to be thrown away, and they arrange a marriage. And Bindu is married off to a madman. And Bindu has to finally commit suicide because she doesn't have anywhere to go. She doesn't have anywhere to go. Minal, as she ends the letter, writes that I have finally realized who I am. I have finally found a place for myself, and I am going to live here. And then she says, don't think that I'm going to commit suicide. I wouldn't do that. I will survive. So Sikhetro is the home where she has freedom, or the freedom she was craving all her life to find. She says that she's a poet, she has intellect, and the in-laws family were kind of afraid of her intellect. So this is the place, Sikhetro, which is her home, and she has understood after 15 years of conjugal life that the home at Makhun Bora Lane in Kolkata is not her home. The in-laws' home is not her home, but the one that she has found in Sikhetro is her home. Importantly, she finishes a letter, and which is quite disruptive. Let me just read the lines from here. So she says, Minal ends the letter signing her name with the subscription, free from the shelter beneath your feet, as against the traditional reverential address, your revered lotus feet, with which the letter began. So for her, the husband is dead, and she is going to live all alone in her freedom in Puri. Well, as we can probably understand, the to room 19 is is a wonderful story, of course. It's Lessing's signature story. It is one of the most read stories by Lessing. But the connection that it has with Tegu's story, which is really fascinating to note. As I said at the beginning, I don't know whether Lessing has ever read the story because the translation was not available in the 60s, at least before the publication of To Room 19. But the connection that Buthini was talking about, the original mind. So how the original mind negotiate other original minds in creativity. That's wonderful to know. So as we know in the story, Susan, after 12 years of her conjugal life, understands that the house at Richmond is not really her home. So she would be, she would be inventing a character she would be she should be going to the room number 19, and where she would be alone, alone, alone. And if we, I remember that is what. Let me quote from the fascinating line from the story. So this is, she dreamed of having a room or a place anywhere where she could go and sit by herself, no one knowing where she was. So that's to room 19. That's room 19 provides her that opportunity. And she is all by herself. She doesn't have to be worried about anything, but of course, she cannot really forget all others. So, what she says that in her 12 years of conjugal life, she didn't have any freedom. That is, she would have to be always care for the family, the husband, Matthew, and the four kids. So she seldom had a minute for
Dr. Ehsan, your voice is not audible any longer.
Yeah, something's happened to the. Yeah, it's clearing up now, I think.
and that's why. Can you hear me?
Yes, better now, I guess so.
Hello?
Now we can,
Okay.
but it's breaking when
Thank
you
you.
speak.
Uh, anyway, so that's how it is, and where we can see a connection between Tagore and, of course, Lissy. So that's what I can share this moment. So thank you very much for being with me. It's been a wonderful opportunity for sharing my thoughts with you. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed Isanuzaman, for sharing this wonderful comparison of two beautiful stories. Tagore's stories, in fact, I mean, yes, definitely he is the master storyteller we have. Uh, and This comparison of the two stories, in fact, I mean, though, like, you haven't talked about that, but I know as from your bio note that you've been working on A Doll's House also. So, I mean, I find that there are a number of similarities between The Wife's Letter and A Doll's House as well. So, number of intertextual references, but as you mentioned, that there are the two original minds. I mean, um, even when they don't know each other, even when they haven't worked together, even when they haven't read each other's work, even then, I mean, they do think similar. I mean, they're negotiating the social issues in the same way. Their assessment of the social problems in the same way. So also, I mean, to room 19 often is regarded with vis-a-vis a room of one's own of Virginia Woolf. So yes, there are a number of intertextual references to one of the best works of modern times, um, uh, these two works have intertextual references to number of other stories as well, number of other works as well. But definitely two of the best stories, I would say. So now I open the house for discussion. I call upon other people who have any observation, any query, any question which they would like to put across to Dr. Ahmed Ehsanuzaman. Yes, please. We have Swarnendu Dam. He has raised his hand. So again, Swati, is the control for unmuting with you, or he can do it himself?
No,
He
I
can do it
can.
himself.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Uh, So, sir, I have a question for you. Firstly, like it was a very enriching talk. I have read Street Potro. My question is something like this: that we can see that, as you have said, both Tagore and Doris Lessing has uh, thought of, I would not say alienation, but a kind of solitude uh, as the pathway for uh, having a kind of liberation. Like both in the stories, we get that they are getting alienated, not alienated from the like social world, and they are uh, keep having their life to themselves only. But in Lessing's work, we can as well see like a character like maybe Mary Turner in Racist Singing. Alienation is working in a negative way on her psyche, and he is choosing to suicide at the end of the story. So I would like to say, like, how will you like make a balance of these two? Like in one stories or in one kind of a way, we can say that alienation or living alone is leading to a kind of liberation, while in the other we are saying that it is alienation which is affecting someone like psychologically deeply in a psychological way.
Uh, thank you for the question. Well, that's yes, that's one way of looking at the stories. I mean, the close closing of the stories. Yes, in Tagore, yes, one can be alienated even when living in a society. We're full of people, but you don't have anything to share ideas. So that's obviously alienation, and it happens to both the protagonists, Minal and Suzanne. So Minal is going to see Cutthroat, and of course she even Sikhat is not absolutely secular, of course. It's kind of crowded place. But even in crowds, you can have circulation. You can have your own freedom and liberty. In case of Suzanne, she is she is also looking out for liberation, freedom, and she is, you know, severing her ties with her with the ones she has been living for 12 years or so. Yes, she is driven to end her life, uh, and she's. But the fact that if you how to negotiate that, that is what how we can look at it. That is whether there can be any balance between the two. Well, what I think is that she she is kind of moved by the alienation, and she this I mean the ending, the way she ends, the story ends. She's trying to find a place the way what you call one I mean Ophelia. I mean Ophelia's suicide. That is, it's it's kind of a release, or it can be also a disruptive kind of thing. So that's how the connection, and that's how it departs. And Ujjwal was mentioning Doll's House, and Tagore of course knew about Doll's House, and Shunjukta Dasgupta, she informs us that Tagore wrote the story Steve Potro, the Earth's Letter, inspired by Doll's House. And Tagore has another wonderful story, which is uh, in Bangla it's called Poila number one. And here we also have a departing woman, Onila. Onila lives, and at her departure, she says that do not look for me, you will never find me. And her husband is famous, and the husband and the friends talk about Ibsen and others, but how insensitive the husband could be because he didn't have any time for her wife. So that's why the woman lives in Kuala Lumpur. So Tagore is familiar with all sorts of these things.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ehsan, I would also like to know that does Bengali culture has a specific emphasis on beautiful feet? I mean, Nirnal you said that it means lotus feet probably. So,
Lotus.
Lotus.
lotus feet, yes. So, lotus, just lotus.
Just
Yes,
lotus.
yes.
Okay, okay. Somewhere I read that. I mean, she has beautiful feet as well. So I just wanted to know: is there a special significance of feet and the beauty of feet in Bengali culture, and at the same time, feet also refer to mobility. So, I mean, a woman who has very beautiful feet, does it in a way means that the culture actually uh, wants that people women should have beautiful feet, means that they should not move around a lot and maybe do not go outside the houses. uh, is, is there any such reference as well?
Well, maybe I'm not quite sure because I have not seen women's feet being emphasized in Bengali literature. Maybe Sati and others, Chandova, can shed light on that. But
Could I come in?
I was
yes,
just thinking, Swati, I
Yeah,
just have
I
a small observation to make, which is that, this dialogue that centers all scrubbing to bathtubs, scrubbing our feet when Raj Kumar said,
या ये पाँव गंदे मैले हो जाएंगे इसको
आपके
जमीन
पैर
पे मत
जमीन पर मत लगाइए, right? So
yeah, absolutely. But
fetishes is there.
I'm going to be the bad moderator. I'm going to bring this session to a close because there's Srijoni waiting and there is Robin waiting. We thought we are going to have a blank session. We have sessions which is spilling over into each other. So I think we can kind of congratulate ourselves. However, because Ujjwal asked, and because there have been so much talk about women, uh, I'm sure you're asking up. And just Shonindu, on a very light note, for your answer, if my take on your answer is Delhi ki laddu. Okay, for the woman and the alienation bit, not married alienated. It's Delhi ki laddu.
What is
Uh,
Dilli Laddu?
दिल्ली की लड्डू जो खाए वो पछता है जो ना खाए वो पछता है so that is the one and here the
Great
women,
analogy, ma'am.
yeah, absolutely. And and the women's feet part Ujjal, Lokhi Sri, the bride is always Lakshmi. And in Bengal, we draw the feet of Lakshmi. That is one of the most auspicious symbols in Bengali culture, Hindu culture at least, where the feet is drawn, and it is nice, graceful, tiny. And if you ever read the what we call the Panchali, the Broto Katha or the Vrat of Lakshmi, if you read that, then you know what you're supposed to be and which you are not. uh, the not part I think I am adding, but yeah, the Loki Brotokatha gives it's a kind of a handbook for what women are supposed to be, especially married women.
Okay.
Okay, so the feet comes in there, and the feet also was there in Pakiza. You can put the two together, but I have to call this session to an end.
Well,
And
just one very, very quickly, I'll add to it. So I watched this movie Bulbul. I wonder if anyone
oh
else
yes, yes.
also has watched it. So Bulbul is about a woman who is a Bengali woman, about Bengali culture, and this woman, she puts her feet in a red colored color when she's married to the man, and she comes inside the house. but later on her feet are he is suspicious about her um, uh,
Activities.
yes, about her morality, about her moral character, and he damages her feet, and she becomes a witch, and whatever is the story, but the feet never go out, and the damaging of the feet, I mean, that symbolism, I thought that probably in Bengali culture, this beauty of the feet, and the feet, as you said, Lakshmi's feet coming inside the house when she gets married, and putting them into that vermilion liquid thing. So everything I was connecting, and I thought probably, I mean, there is a larger significance, larger reference to it. But anyways, I'll limit this discussion to here only. Probably in some reading session of we will discuss this again. So thank you so much, Dr. Ehsan, for your wonderful comparison. And so we move on to our next session,
Yes.
and I hand over uh, the chair to Swati.
No, not the chair. I'm just the moderator, and
Okay.
I haven't done my little bit, which is given you about Dr. Jaljit, who works as an assistant professor at the Department of English, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. She holds a doctoral degree in the application of theoretical assumptions of systemic functional linguistics on the writings of Doris Lessing. Her interests and areas of specialization include stylistic, systematic functional linguistics, and text analysis, Lessing studies, language and power syntax, and so on. Along with her teaching and research duties, she also writes poetry and short fiction for literary journals and magazines. That was the chair. A very graceful and again a core member of Doris Lessing Society South Asia. Thank you, Ujjwal, for that wonderful job. Thank you, Professor Asanuzaman. We look forward to the paper, which you must write only when your eyes heal. And now we are rushing on to the next one because valedictory session is also upon us. But the final session, in which Dr. Sajesh Bapala will do the honors of chairing the session, where we have student Srijoni Roy Chaudhary, I think, who's going to do a paper. The reason why she's doing the paper today is primarily because of the the thematic resonances between her paper and the valedictory paper that Robin has promised us. So over to Sajesh Bapala, who is assistant professor, uh, University of Kerala, but I forget the college, which I'll come back and do in the Thanksgiving thing.
Thank
And
you.
Srijani.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Swati. So I welcome all of you to the fourth business session of this online conference, Doris Lessing, Voices from the Margins. So in this session, we have a paper presenter. So the presenter is Srijani Roy Chowdhury. She's a postgraduate student in the Jadavpur University, Kolkata. She has completed her BA in English from the same university. Her area of interest are post-colonial literature, eco-criticism, and animal studies. The paper that she's going to present today is titled Geographies of Resistance, a comparative study of nature's resistance in India and in Africa as seen in Doris Lessing's. This was the old chief's country. So now may I request Srijani Roy Chowdhury to come upon and present her paper.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. So, good evening, everyone. My paper today is basically an eco-critical analysis of Doris Lessing's short story collection, This Was the Old Chief's Country, to highlight how nature participates, both directly and indirectly, in the resistance to colonialism in Lessing's Africa and in the history and literature of colonial India. Now, the reason I've chosen this topic is because of the fact that while it is well recognized that humans are intimately connected to and dependent on their natural environment, nature itself has hardly been acknowledged as a significant player in human history. But Lessing defies this trend in this volume by making the African landscape a powerful and palpable presence that influences the events and people in it in overarching ways and even launches a subtle but determined assault on colonialism. However, nature's revolutionary potential is not something unique to only Lessing. While historical records usually choose to focus only on human activities and their consequences, nature is far from a passive victim and custodian of human history, and it has in fact played an active role in many anti colonial struggles, from inspiring resistance movements to even indirectly participating in them. Now, Lessing's stories act sort of like a capsule of what was really happening across Africa at the time. But it wasn't just Africa, as we can see that the situations Lessing depicted in her stories were also being acted out in reality in the colonized nations of South Asia. Let me start by pointing out how a major source of economic profit for colonizers in both India and Africa were indigenous natural resources, which led to their wanton exploitation and the marginalization of natives who were dependent on them. We can see from historical records of colonial India that tribal communities were displaced and forests were rapidly depleted to match the demand for timber for constructing ships and railways. This is a feature of colonial natural exploitation also evident in Lessing's The Old Chief Mashalanga, where the eponymous chief and his tribe lose all their land as European settlers encroach on it to build farms. However, the clear disparity between the natives' sustainable relationship with the land and the colonial exploitation of it gets reflected in the landscape itself. While the white farm only has harsh, eroded soil and decapitated trees, the land under Chief Mashalanga's jurisdiction is still lush, green, and with a quote unquote vein of richness. What Lessing shows here is nature's clear refusal to be as bountiful to the colonizers that exploit it as it has been to natives. This disparity ultimately leads to the narrative's realization that despite the political and economic control colonizers may exert over captured territories, they will never be able to, quote unquote, call a country to heel like a dog when the only relationship they share with it is one of exploitation. This subversive power of the colonized landscape was also recognized by the British in colonial India. For instance, the 1905 partition of Bengal was motivated by the desire to curb nationalist movements in Bengal by dividing the land and the people on communal lines. But the decision instead led to mass uprisings and produced a spate of literature promoting Hindu Muslim solidarity that interestingly used Bengal's natural landscape to unite Bengalis of all religions. The ecologically focused titles of some texts produced in this period clearly establish a close relationship between the indigenous natural environment and the humans enduring the trauma of partition. For instance, Shankar Ghosh's Shukuri Boner Shari, translated as Rose of Betel Trees, and Syed Waliullah's Ikti Tulsi Gachir Kahini, The Tale of a Tulsi Plant. Even the national anthem of Bangladesh, Amar Sonar Bangla, which was composed by Rabindranath Tagore in response to the 1905 partition, draws in the natural beauty of Bengal, such as Bengal's mango groves, paddy fields, and banyan trees, to inspire patriotic spirit. The ability of the natural landscape to produce feelings of home and belonging is well documented in Edward Said's Orientalism, where he describes how the colonizers' efforts to transform conquered territories into images of their homeland, quote, alienated the indigenous people from their authentic traditions, ways of life, and political organizations, unquote. This is something we also see in Lessing stories, where white settlers constantly try to control and remold the African environment. But the environment also resists their attempts at control, thereby destabilizing colonial power equations. In the duets Come to Kloof Grange, for instance, Mrs. Gale stoically tries to ignore the intoxicating scent of the nearby river, which she finds dirty, dangerous and unpleasantly characteristic of Africa. But this scent is also an uncomfortable reminder of her dependence on the African river water to sustain her own prized English garden. In A Sunrise on the Veld, nature forces a boy to confront his role in the gruesome death of a young buck, thereby forcing colonizers to accept responsibility for the disturbing effects of colonial intervention into the indigenous natural environment. Now, considering nature's ability to problematize colonial power relations, it is fitting that in The Nuisance, it is an act of defiance enacted with the help of natural resources that upsets the usual balance of colonial life. When an African woman drowns herself in the well to protest her mistreatment by her husband, the unbearable stench forces the otherwise dismissive farm owners to stop all activities and immediately get the well cleaned. Although this is, of course, a tragic event, it is important to note that while the woman would have been paid little attention by her husband and the settlers if she had killed herself using other means, her act of drowning herself in the communal water source disrupts everyone's lives and compels them to posthumously award her the recognition she had earlier sought. It also reveals just how much colonizers depend on indigenous natural resources and how effective a protest can be when it disrupts this exploitative relationship. Similar methods of protest were also adopted in colonial India. Much like in The Nuisance, in the 1859 Indigo Revolt in India, impoverished indigo farmers rebelled against European indigo planters by bringing the cultivation and export of the profitable indigo crop to a screeching halt. Its severe economic and political repercussions forced the government to appoint an indigo commission to address the demands of the otherwise neglected indigo farmers, eventually leading to the decline of the predatory Bengal indigo industry. Now, while these instances show how nature subverts colonial power relations and provides avenues for effective anti-colonial protests, it does not imply that nature is always an amiable ally of the colonized. Nature can, in fact, be both kind and bounteous, but also dangerous and ruthless. This is evident in the unforgiving nature of the Veld in Leopard George, where an African woman is just as likely to get hunted by a leopard as a foreign settler. Nevertheless, in most literary works and historical records, native inhabitants are generally seen to share a more intimate and harmonious relationship with their natural environment and are subsequently able to use this to their advantage. Their struggles against colonialism are often supported by nature itself. For instance, Lessing's No Witchcraft for Sale shows how natives defy colonizers to protect their natural environment and how nature in turn rewards and supports them. When a snake spits into Teddy's eyes in the story, Mrs. Farquhar's Western remedies are rendered useless, and it is only the root that their cook Gideon retrieves from the jungle that can cure him. In all of Lessing's stories, in fact, she shows white farmers ravaging Africa's velds and jungles. But the quote-unquote ancient wisdom of leaf and soil and season is a privilege that remains the black man's heritage, and it is in turn protected by natives like Gideon from foreign appropriation. Now, if No Witchcraft for Sale depicts how natives are rewarded with some of nature's secrets due to their generations of coexistence, Little Tembi reveals how effortlessly nature embraces natives as an extension of itself. Unlike Tembi, who knows the intimate secrets of the veld so well that he seems to almost merge into it, all Jane can see beyond the structured farmland is an indistinguishable and intimidating green bush. In colonial India, too, natives often found inspiration and assistance for anti-colonial movements in nature itself, such as in the Swadeshi movement, which promoted self-reliance and boycotted English goods. Like Gideon and his naturally derived medicine, the Swadeshi movement was successful because people found a ready natural alternative for expensive imported cotton cloth and khadi, a hand-spun fabric composed entirely of natural fiber. Gideon's fears about having his people's traditional remedies appropriated by colonizers may also seem justified when we consider Gandhi's Swords Satyagraha. which urged people to reclaim the production of their own salt that had been monopolized by the British to impose exorbitant salt taxes on the Indians. However, while the Swadeshi movement and the salt satyagraha are non-violent and positive examples of the indirect support nature provides in anti-colonial struggles, this support can also take on a much darker character, as across the world, violent anti-colonial protests have often led to mass bloodshed on both sides. In Lessing's The Second Hut, this violence is not inflicted directly by human beings, but affected through the natural environment. When the native farmhand's complaints about Van Heerden's verbal and physical abuse are repeatedly brushed off by Major Carruthers, they turn to a more sinister remedy and set fire to the hut that they had been forced to build for Van Heerden, causing one of his children to die in the blaze. Although Major Carruthers knows that the natives were responsible for the fire, they are all aware that a single fire can never be traced back to an individual in the vast fells of Africa, especially when it is a native well versed in the ways of the natural environment and who knows that the veld will not betray him by revealing evidence of his actions. In Little Tembe, too, Jane implores Tembe to escape the police by disappearing into the bush, where the foreign police could, quote, no more reach him than they could lay their hands on a shadow, unquote. It is evident that from the second hut to Little Tembe, the ways in which nature participates in anti-colonial movements varies greatly across Lessing's stories and these historical examples from colonial India. However, a feature common to them all is nature's active and spirited resistance to colonialism. While nature can be equally ruthless towards both foreigners and natives, the reason why it seems to assist the latter in anti-colonial struggles is in the relationship they share with nature. While indigenous people in India and Africa have usually been documented to possess a sustainable and respectful relationship with the environment, most cases of foreign colonization have unfortunately been accompanied by indiscriminate ecological destruction. And it is this destruction which prompts nature's retaliation and retribution. In both Indian history and in Lessing's Africa, nature resists the onslaught of colonial exploitation either indirectly, that is, by inspiring resistance movements and providing natives the tools to fight colonization, or directly, by retaliating against colonial exploitation through the silent, subversive power of the natural environment. Nature's humbling power brings us back to Lessing's statement in the preface to the 1964 collection. Africa gives you the knowledge that man is a small creature among other creatures in a large landscape, quote unquote. We may in fact expand this statement to include not just Africa, but also other colonized nations like India, where nature has been a source of strength, support, and inspiration in battles against colonialism. Therefore, it is fitting that the apparently disparate colonial experiences of India and Africa are connected by nature, where nature rewards those who respect it, which is a lesson I'm sure we can all bear in mind in this age of the Anthropocene. That was all from me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Srijani Roy Chakravarti. So your paper was really very interesting, particularly so Lessing when she writes about her experience of life in Africa and depicting the life of the people in Africa. So really, she expresses a kind of conformity with the indigenous features, the indigenous nature of the particular land. We never feel that she is a white person writing about the experience of the people in the Africa. Rather, we feel she is on among the African people. That's what makes her writing special for reading, and particularly so in your insights, like so the way that she conforms with the nature, particularly the living organisms, the flora and fauna, such like so she's revealing a kind of a different kind of experience. So the way that you tackled the topic really was interesting, and you were really able to connect that with the national movement in India and the indigenous culture, the indigenous the attempt to evolve an indigenous fight against colonialism. That was really amazing. So
Thank you
now the
so
time is
much.
for, yeah, now the time is for a discussion. So I would like to invite all of you to come with questions so that she will be able to clarify it. So Swanendu is there. Could you just rise up your question?
Yeah. So, Fusion, it's a like amazing paper. I really enjoyed it. But so I have a. You talked about like environmental consciousness or eco consciousness mainly. That thing. So I am currently working on a project that is dealing with environmental justice and community justice together. And while doing that thing, I just came to know about that. Uh, like recently, there is a discourse coming up that when we are talking about environmentalism, there is often we tend to forget about the communities that is living under the environment. So we are excluding the communities and focusing only on the environment. So I was just reading your abstract, and there you have written, and also while discussing your paper, you have mentioned that when you were reading that this short story collection, this was Orchid's Country, you found that the colonial atrocities were largely in the background, and the emphasis was there in the like pleasant nature and all the flora, fauna, all these kinds of things. So I would like to ask, like, as you are like working on eco-consciousness and environmentalism, so what's your take on that? Like, how important it is to bring the real atrocities of the communities living under that maybe beautiful flora and fauna, if we really try to achieve an environmental justice? Over to you.
Thank you for that question.
Srijani, you are not audible.
Hello, I just
Yeah,
got disconnected.
yeah,
Are
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So obviously, I think it is important to study and explore the disturbing effects of colonialism, which a lot of people have already done. But what I found in this short story collection is this was published in 1952, so it probably wasn't like very early on in in the colonization of Zimbabwe and South Africa. So what Lessing did was mainly, I think, a more nuanced representation of racial tension. It's more like an insidious, simmering kind of tension rather than outright brutality and violence. So it seemed fitting that even nature, the way she showed nature, the veld, and all the trees in Africa seemed very subdued and understated. Like if you don't look closely, you don't really notice that there is a lot of resistance to colonialism happening there, except maybe more overtly in stories like The Second Hut. But it's always present how nature slowly but surely kind of tries to subvert racial inequality and colonialism. So I thought it was a pretty nuanced, rounded take on nature's resistance to it. So hopefully I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
No, I would like to come in and again call this session to an end, call it a day, go over to the valedictory, but taking on Srijani and Shaunendu's questions yet again. Uh, One, what Srijani said is quite right, even though she was probably guessing at it, that Lessing there have been, yesterday I did mention that African critics of Lessing have pointed out that she takes on a very romantic idea about what Shaninde is pointing out to be the flora and fauna and the beauty and the power of nature, which is something very colonial in its gaze, as it were. But on the other hand, what Srijani has also said, perhaps, and this is that there's a sustainable approach to nature, which is there in indigenous culture, but which is perhaps not there in post-industrial, post-colonial culture, where perhaps Shanindu, you are coming in, and Lessing was not there. If that
No,
makes
I mean,
sense.
Swati, I just want to really say this. In the
Yes,
grass grazing thing, you
yes.
have the turners, okay?
The Turners and
You
Dick.
have Turner who suffers because he will not take on the colonial practice. So he is looking at multiple cropping, he's looking
Absolutely.
growing little things, and he's doing very badly. And they all hate him and they want his land because he's managed to make it look so green and lush. So they do
Yes.
everything. I mean, they hate his wife. So they do everything to get him off, and he sort of goes half crazy by the end of the narrative. So, and Lessing is recording that very, very powerfully.
Yeah,
So he's
absolutely. I was thinking of Dick Turner, and I remember in my reading of and writing of Grasses Singing, I've always mentioned, because Dick is one of those characters who kind of, draws your attention in spite of everything else that is happening, to which he apparently seems not to be contributing. But he is that reluctant colonial that you have mentioned,
yes.
and perhaps is more close to Lessing than obviously Lessing doesn't really feel she's at all in tune with Mary Turner. So I think Dick is, and I think somewhere she also mentions that she fashioned him after her own father.
Hmm. And she
So,
likes him. I mean,
and she likes him,
it's a
yes.
huge thing
That's
for Lessing. I mean, and all the male critics are usually shouting and saying she doesn't like men. You know.
no, no, she likes men, all right. She married thrice. Come
No, no,
on.
no, she doesn't like. I mean, she doesn't give you likable male characters in her fiction. I mean, they were talking about her choices.
Perhaps not likable for men.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think Robin is.
Yes, Robin is going to give up on us because she got up
Yes,
early
she's
and
sleeping
she's
around
waiting,
at the moment.
and
I
we haven't called her.
Yes,
So,
So,
we have to close this session. But Srijani, I think that was a brilliant paper.
yes.
And
Thank
Sajesh,
you so
thank
much.
you so
thank
much.
you. Thank you, Srijani. Now over to Dr. Swati, please.
Yeah, it's actually over to Robin, Professor Robin Wiesel, uh, who Professor Robin Wiesel is from the Furman University, Professor Emeritus. She's published on Doris Lessing, Nadine Godimer, Bessie Head, Alexander Kanangoni, Lawrence Durrell, and Olive Schreiner in journals such as Commonwealth Literature, Research in African Literatures, and Doris Lessing Studies. She is a past editor of Doris Lessing Studies and currently its secretary. But that is on a more formal note. On a more personal note, Robin has been one of the stoic supporter I have had from Doris Lessing Society, and who, along with Joseph Reggae, has supported this chapter, has spoken for us in the society, and has been completely invested in it. So much so she wakes up early in the morning. It is very early. So good morning, Robin, and a
Good
very
morning, sir.
warm welcome to you. She's going to present a paper, uh, from margins to center to margins, a geography of Doris Lessing. Over to Professor Robin Visser.
Many thanks to Swati and her colleagues for the opportunity to participate in this fascinating and important Doris Lessing webinar. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
My sound is good? Okay. Albeit with a 12.5 hour time difference. It's that half hour that's really confusing, like which way is it, Anyway, time difference between Indian Standard Time and Pacific Daylight Time, where I am in California. So I have been here. I was mostly lurking in my pajamas through much of the much of the last two days, but I've been listening. I've been so impressed by the ingenious and creative pairings of Lessing with her contemporary South Asian writers, among other topics that connect Lessing to India and South Asia. Collectively, you're opening up Lessing's studies to generate more inclusive models of world literature, delineating South Asian perspectives on her feminism, her anti-colonialism, her Sufism, her existentialism, her complicated relationships to the metropolis and to the natural environment of Africa. Buthina Majul added today her magisterial survey of Lessing's career from the point of view of Tunisia and Islam. Radha Chakraborty explained in her keynote address how different forms of marginality intersect and margin and center mutate in Lessing's work. Together, the papers delivered here create a portrait of Doris Lessing as a hybrid colonial figure with an ambivalent relationship to the center, to which she migrated, and an abiding attraction to marginalized people and marginalized discourse. Before I delve deeper into these issues, let me take a moment to greet you on behalf of the Doris Lessing Society and encourage you to join our dues-free International Society. Our business meeting will be held in January on Zoom and will include short presentations by the speakers at January's Modern Language Association convention, with which our society is affiliated. In addition, please encourage your postgraduate and upper undergraduate students to submit to our annual essay contest, with entries due in December. I can answer any questions about the society and the contest. I have a short informal talk, which will be followed, I hope, by more dialogue. I have been reading and studying and writing about Doris Lessing since the 1970s, and so have come to accumulate, sort of by accident, a body of knowledge about her work and the scholarship that surrounds it. At this point in my journey as a Lessing scholar, I'm most interested in using the specifics of her life and work to sketch the bigger picture of her significance and influence. I have been witness to the ways in which Lessing readership and scholarship have waxed and waned around the world over these many decades. She began as a figure on the margins of literature in English, publishing her poems and stories in small magazines in Rhodesia and South Africa. Upon her emigration to Britain in 1949, her first novel, The Grass is Singing, propelled her into the center of the London literary scene. During the 1950s and 60s, she became well known in Britain. Her reception in Southern Africa moved from controversial to less relevant as Black African literature mapped a trajectory that excluded white African émigré writers. By the late 1960s, in the wake of the American publication of The Golden Notebook and the completion of the Children of Violence series, she was lionized in the North American Academy, a trend which she loathed because she felt it distorted her complex work in the service of a particular kind of second-wave feminism, which she swore she didn't adhere to. After rejecting colonialism and losing faith in communism, Lessing perhaps was allergic to the reductiveness of isms. She was, I believe, much more receptive to her readers outside the Academy. She kept telling the literary critics who wanted to interview her to go off and write their own novels and leave her work alone. She gravitated towards the book-hungry girls of the forsaken corners of the world, like the woman she describes in her 2007 Nobel lecture, devouring Anna Karenina in a dusty Indian shop. Note the ethnographic placement there. Dusty Indian shop in drought-stricken Zimbabwe. She writes, quote, "That girl, trudging through the dust, dreaming of an education for her children. Do we think that we are better than she is? We, stuffed full of food, our cupboards full of clothes, stifling in our superfluities? I think it is that girl and the women who were talking about books and an education when they had not eaten for 3 days that may yet define us," unquote. In one of her last important public statements, then, Lessing rejected the Western Metropolitan Center for the margins from which she herself had come, her beloved Zimbabwe. "It was the people there," she told the Nobel audience, "who will define us." That us pronoun seems intentionally slippery. Certainly, it challenges the distinction between self and other, and empowers those who might be seen by the Nobel lecture audience as marginalized, even lesser. In Martha Quest, Lessing called Africa her lodestone, that is, her magnet. Throughout her work, she returns again and again to its searing beauty, brutal poverty, and wealth of human culture. Even as she spent over 60 years in London, engaged in its intellectual and political discourses over the decades, her imagination sought the southern skies of Africa and the formative history of settler colonialism. Even as she became a big-name author, she fought the strictures of the literary establishment. Over time, thumbing her nose at realism, modernism, and postmodernism, turning towards the less well-regarded popular genres of science fiction and romance. She wrote about vagrants and terrorists, feral children, and prehistoric humans she dared her critics to follow. They weren't all sure they wanted to. By the time Doris Lessing died, 2013, her literary star had begun to wane in the United Kingdom and North America. Fewer of her works were studied and published on. She was long and heavy, her output seen as uneven. Her white, privileged anti-colonialism was irrelevant to most African readers and scholars. For Anglo-American readers, her depiction of gender, for example, homosexuality, was dated and stereotypical. Her views of female and male sexuality, for example, seemed essentialist. Her mysticism was alienating, her politics increasingly conservative. However, as I was editing Doris Lessing studies and organizing conference panels, we received more and more submissions from Europe, from Turkey, from North Africa, South Asia, China, and Taiwan. Lessing was being read in multiple languages and interpreted in new ways beyond the ken of the Anglo-American literary establishment, as the speakers at this event have absolutely demonstrated. Lessing, the world writer, has been reclaimed by the regions and cultures beyond the so-called center. At this year's earlier Modern Language Association panels on Lessing, held remotely, we hosted participants from around the globe. I organized a roundtable on multilingual Doris Lessing, intended as an update of a 1990 volume of essays entitled In Pursuit of Doris Lessing, 9 Nations Reading. The international scholars discussed issues of translation in social, cultural, as well as linguistic terms. Their presentations were revelatory of the myriad ways that Lessing's work is alive in many corners of the world, as your presentations over the last 2 days have shown too. Well, this brings us to an interesting question. Why are people in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and China and Turkey and Eastern Europe and Tunisia studying Doris Lessing? You can best answer that question. I'd like to hear it. But let me first posit a theory. I begin by trying to define her nationality. The geographical and historical facts are clear. Lessing was born in Persia, which was then in the British imperial sphere. Her parents were English. She spent most of her childhood and early adult life until the age of 30 in the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, as part of the small but all-powerful white settler community, and the rest of her long life in England, mainly in London. She was a British citizen. But what did it mean to be a British citizen from 1919 to 2013? For much of that time, it meant to be a privileged member of a far-flung empire, which even as a post-empire, remained a center of cultural power. As a colonial in London in the 1950s, she was an insider-outsider, not quite one of us. In her early work, through the 1960s, she dissected the power dynamics of colonial Africa through the lens of the Communist Party's critique of apartheid. At a time when the liberal political spectrum in Rhodesia and South Africa advocated the gradual devolution of the colonial system of racial classification, the communist line supported revolution. As the Children of Violence novels and the memoir Going Home delineate, Lessing's politics led to her wrenching, emotionally costly exile from Africa. From the sidelines in London, she continued to advocate for the anti-racist class struggle to overthrow settler dominance. At the same time, she became enmeshed in the unraveling of the British Communist Party, which she left, along with many other intellectuals, in the wake of revelations of the atrocities committed under Stalinism and then the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. Lessing then became a small c communist, a partyless adherent of the Marxist ideals. As the 1960s crystallized the threat of nuclear war, she marched with the campaign for nuclear disarmament and swam in the waters of countercultural self-exploration. The zeitgeist led her through Jungian dream analysis and R.D. Laing's healing embrace of madness to extrasensory perception and the Sufi teachings of Idris Shah. Lessing chronicled her journeys in her novels of the 1960s and 70s and in her autobiographies of that period. She wrote from the point of view of women characters, much like herself, ironically self-aware and analytical, even as they threw themselves into sexually and emotionally dangerous experiments. She was always, as jealously noted by her rival writers, such as her lover Clancy Siebel, always writing, generating the novels and stories and pounding out reviews and essays to support herself as an author. As the decades progressed, North London was her place, but the historical current was her muse. As she circled back again and again to the histories of her parents, to the world wars of the 20th century, and the toxic myths of empire, from British to Canopian. Space fiction epic channeled her critique of colonialism, even as her work became more mythic, her warnings of human apocalypse more urgent. Doris Lessing broke out of the bonds of nationality defied the conventions of center and margin, as she rejected the isms of her time. Her identity was something of a conundrum: anti-colonial white settler African, anti-communist party communist, anti-literary establishment writer, anti-feminist icon. Her complicated depiction of what it meant to be a free woman in the 20th century still resonates. A rebel daughter of empire, she also rebelled against the conventional expectations of motherhood. The Doris Lessing Society's 2023 Modern Language Association panel is about Lessing's ambivalent motherhood in the context of writers like Jenny Diski, Elena Ferrante, and Mieko Kawakami. Our panel, entitled Working Mothers, Lost Daughters, addresses the very relevant convention theme of working conditions. To sum up then, Doris Lessing continues to surprise, to be read anew. To try to map the geography of her work and its impact is to focus on the expanding margins of her posthumous influence. In her talk yesterday, Radha Chakraborty sketched a vision of intersectionality, the intersection of different forms of marginality and the mutation of margin and center in Lessing's work. I believe that is how the author herself would have liked to be understood by scholars who were decentering the Anglo-American Academy, of which she was so critical, and revealing aspects of her work that have in fact been marginalized by Anglo-American critics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. You have a question that while outside the Anglo-American pedagogy, we are still reading Lessing. And my question in this entire situation, because of the things that you have pointed out, given her very supposedly conservative ideas about sexuality, in the up and coming ideas of sexuality that has taken the world, especially the Anglo-American world, which is also penetrating into the non-Anglo-American world. Whether this is not a question maybe I would have asked when we were forming the chapter, but more and more with the COVID and with the influence of American cultural imperialism, as we call it in very Marxist terms, I honestly wonder how much of our culture would engage with Lessing after a while. So it's heartening that the students, the younger scholars, have been reading her even in a more of a compulsive manner. So some of them are here. So perhaps we would ask, let them take a take on what was your initial question as to this being her legacy. And Bothania has also given us today the legacy that we have from Lessing. Maybe I would ask them to respond before we who actually belong to an older generation, who had no access to other forms of exposure than books. We can come in later, but maybe the younger people in the audience and who were presenting and who had perhaps read the initial Lessing could come up with something before we take a take on whatever Robin is saying and explore it. Would anybody like to take on it? Since they have, yes, Shanil.
You have started with
You're cracking up.
Like,
Your voice is cracking up. I'll switch myself off. I'll switch myself off. I'm sure he is going to reconnect. If there's, yes,
am I audible now? Like,
absolutely.
yeah. So yeah, as I was saying that my exposure to Doris Lessing began with Swati ma'am's classes itself. Like she taught us Gracie singing in our masters. After that, I liked Doris Lessing a lot. Like when I read Gracie singing because of the like open ending. We don't after reading that like there were multiple ideas like why uh, that Mary Turner was killed and all those kinds of things. I was thinking of my own and all other psychological aspects, the communist aspect, all these things. But for this particular presentation, I focused on Sufism, that aspect of her life, and while doing reading about Sufism, I found like stark similarities between how Sufism, the idea of spirituality and Sufism that is present, that we can see in her the memoirs of a survivors is like similar with the idea of Shahujiya Baul tradition. And like yesterday only, Swati ma'am was telling me that why don't you just discard the idea of Sufism and just particularly focus on a particular Bengali Shahujiya Baul reading of uh, Doris Lessing itself, because spirituality is ultimately spirituality by whatever lens you see. So I think just I have just started reading Doris Lessing and I could find that okay, just probably a novel which is I don't know like how much it is discussed in academic areas, because I know of the Grassy singing and books like Golden Notebook are like quite popular in academia, but I don't know like how much exposure a Memoirs of Survivor gets in like major academia in translation studies. But if that kind of a novel also brings us closer with other traditions, which is based particularly on South Asia, then I can just feel that how much more we can explore. Uh, yeah, so that's
Right. Swarnendu, one of the things that you said that I thought was so important was that Lessing's critics have marginalized her Sufism. Right. I mean, that's a good example of the
yes.
kind of knowledge
I
that
did not like want to.
you can bring to Lessing that many of her British or American critics just don't have that depth of knowledge or understanding, and so they tend to either kind of dismiss it or treat it as or interpret it as some sort of, I don't know, more symbolic sort of mysticism that they are more comfortable with, because they don't have that depth of understanding. Um, we published in Doris Lessing Studies a couple of years ago a great article by a Turkish scholar about Lessing's Sufism, Lessing as a Sufi writer. You know, he was someone who has that depth of understanding that many in the, let's say, Anglo-American Academy just don't have and aren't even sympathetic to.
Another thing, Robin, what Shanindu has brought up again is what, if you remember, Seda had also, maybe it was not Seda, but somebody else as well who had presented in the MLA. And the idea was which books are being chosen by the pedagogic or, in the teaching, and which is being left out. I think very important, which is being left out. Like a book like, say, Love Again, perhaps did not really get the kind of attention which I think it could have got, because it's a brilliant book in which Lessing has brought everything in that one can think of, uh, and yet I don't really know how much. one gets to read about love again, how much people are investing once in the reading of that text.
Yeah,
That's
Right.
another text that I would say has been marginalized by the critics,
completely.
partly because it's seen as less sort of formally complicated and interesting than the Golden Notebook, right? It's not the Golden Notebook. She wrote the Golden Notebook, and she moved on
Yes.
to experiment with other genres, more popular genres, and that book is controversial in its own way. Love Again. She's writing about the female sexuality of older women, a very taboo subject that she characteristically was not afraid to to tackle very very frankly.
Robin, I just wanted to add to this. When you say that the Western Academy more or less, ignored Lessing's Sufism, I was thinking of Phyllis Perakis, with whom I've had this very lovely conversation, and she did speak so much about Lessing and the Sufi tradition, and it was, very inspiring to have that conversation with her. But I mean, I personally feel that the greatest damage that was done to Lessing and her belief in Sufism, and I think the sections where she has these stories about the mullah are quite brilliant. Being in the world and not out of it, for instance, or those short stories about Mullah Nasruddin, really life changers or head changers when you read them. But, Jenny Diskey and her narrative, I think, did a lot of damage when she presents Leslie as eccentric, as past her prime, as someone who's coming home with little pieces of silver and saying, we're all going to get bombed out. And I mean, that is the kind of devastating emotional damage that this really does to Leslie. And I don't know whether it's been counted after that. This, of course, is a very subjective, very personal, from the gut response that I'm offering to you.
Yeah, I would say Lessing's posthumous reception has been, yeah, very kind of messy. And maybe that's just how it is.
Yeah, okay.
After an important writer dies, people kind of come out of the woodwork with their stories. Not all of them flattering.
Yep.
But I think I'm fascinated by Diskey's what Diskey brings to the table here in terms of Lessing's biography, especially illuminating Lessing's ambivalent motherhood. I think that's a tremendously important aspect of her work that we're kind of learning more about after her death through the statements of people like Diskey and others close to her. I think that's a fascinating and important area that I think should be explored more.
Yep.
Was there a question in the chat?
Yes, Shanendu has raised his hand, but Umesh has a question. Shanendu, coming back to you, but there's
Sure.
another question there. That do you think if Lessing's life in itself was marginalized?
I'm not sure how I could answer that. I don't know. Maybe I mean I would say that some critics have marginalized aspects of her work, and maybe some of her popular fans, especially, let's say, North Americans, during the heyday of reading Lessing as a feminist icon in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, some of them some of that has kind of maybe pigeonholed her, and is a somewhat reductive way of reading, and that might have kind of pushed her into a critical corner, into a box from which she felt she had to break out. I don't know that you could call someone who was so tremendously prolific marginalized. and who won the Nobel Prize and so on. So
I think she lived life king size
yeah, yeah.
and with such gusto and
Absolutely.
a feisty and autodidactic and brilliant woman. And when we talk about ambivalent motherhood, the life that she talks about in a text like The Sweetest Dream, for instance, where she becomes a kind of earth mother, is quite extraordinary.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I don't think she was marginalized in any manner. I think that is what is so remarkable. Here was this woman who, even in her writing, would not choose a feminist style of writing, feminine style of writing, who said, I want the masculine style because that is the mainstream. And here was someone who dominated the mainstream. I mean, look at all the writers of the 50s in England when she gets there. They're like so suburban and so provincial. But in spite of that, she had this what I would call 360-degree vision, and she could see so much. And I think that is the spectacular thing about her life and her writings.
And she was an internationalist in a very provincial England, that London that thought of itself as the center of the universe, the intellectual universe and cultural universe. I mean, I think her work kind of showed how limited, how provincial that world was in many ways. And maybe it's her internationalism that speaks to her as a world writer now.
I was just wondering, Shenandoah, could you ask, and then that will be the final comment for the night. Then.
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to add a like little thing, if like I'm allowed to, like because
Yeah.
I don't have like much read, but like the little I understood like from that, I would like to just add a simple thing. It is like as we are talking like how listening Sufi period was marginalized by the like main literary critics of that time. I think it is very important to explore that particular phase because like as I was studying that thing for like last like 1 month or so, I found that the question that I asked, like how the two kinds of alienation we find in body slicing, one that we see that alienation or being lonely in a particular place is liberating you, and in another kind of a place where alienation is causing a lot of psychological damage, which may lead to suicide as well. I think that two binaries can only be merged, only be reconciled with the idea, Lessing's idea of Sufism or particular or spirituality or particular Sufism, because when we think about that Jungian idea, which Doris Lessing had studied, and she tried to implicate that thing in her novels, the Jungian idea is descending in the unconscious, that we have to explore your unconscious, but Jungian idea doesn't tell you like you are descending, but then how to ascend that. And that idea Lessing is getting from Sufism, particularly from Idris Shah, like how to explore your higher consciousness that Jung or other Western philosophers or psychologists don't talk about. So she is getting about that how to after descending into the unconscious, how to ascend that thing, how to get yourself out of that pit. She is getting that idea from Idris Shah and from Sufism and other alternate philosophical ideas, which is again marginalized
Yeah,
in Western academia.
yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
uh, absolutely. I think, if I may say this, that what Lessing did, and is that where the West stopped. Yesterday, Ratna was also pointing out to where did she get that figure of the woman who's empowered enough to break the wall and take them one at a time in the memoirs of the survivor. But I was just during this kind of a talk that we are having, I was just wondering whether Robin, you could take this up, or even Ratna, uh, that perhaps her writing about Sufism, her writing in the sci-fi mode or the span fiction mode, um, is something where she had transgressed as the feminist writer. They wanted her, the woman writer, to be the woman writer, to talk about woman things and not really talk about anything else. Like you feel this is something more known to perhaps most people in South Asia, that when Mirabai wanted to sing the songs about Krishna, she was not really permitted to do so, because a woman is supposed to love only the husband and the home and not really some god. She's supposed to perform the rituals of, doing the family puja and things like that, but not really devote herself to God. So Mirabai is not ever going to be an icon other than a transgressive woman icon. But Ramakrishna, who goes and worships his wife, it does become a spiritual leader. And we don't really go back to what Meera is saying other than in the bhajans, but we do go back to what Kabir is saying other than in his bhajans. So Kabir is important, and Ramakrishna is also important. But Mirabai is the transgressive woman. So I think Lessing, perhaps she was constantly overshooting herself, is how I see it. In this conversation that kind of came up, that
And
she kind of walked in where she shouldn't have walked in.
yeah, and only someone in India, Swati, could be making that comparison between Doris Lessing and Mirabai, right? It's a good example of the kind of different knowledge that you are bringing to Doris Lessing studies. Um, but yes, I mean, as speakers like Bothina explained, Lessing was not a feminist, but she didn't want to be a kind of right. What she felt was a limiting doctrinaire American style feminist. That is what really got on her nerves. And so yeah, I think she went out of her way, right, in order maybe just to thumb her nose at those readers, those critics. She dared her readers and critics to follow her. And the space fiction was a bridge too far for a lot of people. I mean, I find it difficult to read. I find it a bit uneven, a bit boring. I mean, honestly, to tell you the truth, right? But that's partly my own prejudices. We all have our prejudices about genre. But even in the space fiction, I mean, my favorite of those is the marriages between 3, 4, and 5. That's all about gender. That's about gender and sexuality, and power relationships amongst the genders. So, she just kept translating in different genres her longtime preoccupations. I mean, those books are about colonialism, right? They're about gender. They're about power. They're about identity. They're about her fears for the future of the human race and so on.
So I also wanted to address Swarnendu Dam's question about Lessing and the energy she draws from Sufism. I would say energy is not only from Sufism, because if she does bridge, she has a character in the Golden Notebook who's imagining herself, she's a blocked writer, and she's imagining herself with her brain sprawled out on the pavement. And interestingly, this whole notion of suicide, Lessing writes the Golden Notebook and it's published in 62, and I think it's in 63 or thereabouts that Sylvia Plath kills herself in England. And it's very, this is something that's always troubled me, because Plath was in need of help. And there was actually a meeting set up between her and Plath. And Lessing met her and she said, I just can't handle her. I just can't help her. Because, there's just too much hyper energy coming from her, and it's not something I can handle at all. So, if you look at a text, and I'm offering this to you because you said you haven't read so much Lessing, and so many things that she writes just, sort of flood through your head when you're listening to something like that. So in the Four Gated City, which is the last of the sequel, Children of Violence, you have Martha Quest. And Martha Quest is, closest to autobiography as it can get. So you have Martha Quest who's looking at literature. And Lessing is always saying that, the library is a university, or she's on all her learning from there. Martha Quest is looking at the kind of literature, the kind of narrative, the kind of philosophies and learnings that get marginalized completely. So it's quite amazing because there are pages and pages of books, pages and pages of theories that are being discarded by the West, and she draws attention to this. And one last footnote, a text that she wrote much, much later, and this is a text in which is also, and I've forgotten the name. What is the last book she wrote, Swati?
The Cleft.
The Cleft, thank you. So,
or is it Alfred and Emily you're talking about?
Alfred and Emily.
Alfred and Emily, yeah.
Alfred and
No, but you're talking about the Cleft.
I'm talking about the Cleft. That's what I'm trying to remember. So in the Cleft, she's talking about going back into time, sort of cosmic time, and you don't know where it's located. But I thought there was this really interesting narrative there about these children, male children, who are taken away and flung on an island, and they're making various codes. And this was like so terrifyingly Hindu in many ways because, they are fed by does in the narrative, and they decide that because the does have fed us, we will not kill them. So I was just thinking, where does this come from? Because we have the right wing screaming about the cow being everybody's mother in India. And so she's also, constantly assimilating from all kinds of sources. And that's really her, her ability to think out of a box all the time. Okay.
I thank Robin for this very early morning session for you and this late session for us, and I will call upon Ojiljeet once again to deliver the final formal vote of thanks, and I think this is the final session, the valedictory. So Ojiljeet gives the vote of thanks, and we call it a night. Yeah. So, Dr. Ojiljeet, Guru Nanak Dev College, Assistant Professor of English.
So this is Dr. Ujjaljit. I am an assistant professor at Department of English, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, popular for Golden Temple. To begin with, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Dr. Josna Rege, the president of Doris Lessing Society, for leading the team with her wonderful poise and her learned inputs and being the motivation for the successful organization of this event. That Dr. Rege could not be part of the conference due to compelling personal reasons, but she had been with us through all the meetings, which have culminated into these final 2 days. So thank you, Dr. Josna. I also take the opportunity to convey my sincere, heartfelt thanks to Dr. Robin Weisel, the secretary to Doris Lessing Society, for the brilliant valedictory address. Her erudite scholarship will guide us further into pursuing the interests of this chapter. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Weisel for stimulating this after the talk discussion, very invigorating. In fact, we all wanted to participate in it, but because of the paucity of the time, we could not. But number of ideas have been generated through this discussion. Thank you so much. Further on, I express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Radha Chakrabarti for delivering an extremely thought-provoking keynote address yesterday and providing number of ideas which the future work of this chapter can be built on. Next, I take the opportunity to express my thankfulness to Dr. Buthina Majol for sparing her time to deliver this special lecture in this newly raised South Asian chapter of DLS. I also convey my thanks for the lovely photo tour that she provided with her slides. I'm also thankful to all the core members of DLS South Asia. So I thank Dr. Ratna Raman for the wonderful chairing of the sessions with her unique, spontaneous style and number of fascinating observations on the papers. Uh, I thank Dr. Chandrava Chakravarti, who is always eager in rendering all kind of support, academic and logistic, as well as she being the director of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media at West Bengal State University. My sincere thanks to Dr. Swati Mitra for being um, always an energetic core member of the team and leading the group activities with exemplary enthusiasm and comradeship. Um, I'm also thankful to Dr. Ahmed Esanuzaman for his extremely calm and poised but amazingly knowledgeable insights. My thanks to Dr. Sajish Vapala for his smooth conduct of the fourth session of the conference. And finally, my sincerest thanks to all the paper presenters for their brilliant research and also to all other attendees for their patient listening and making this conference successful. So, thank you so much, everyone. Together, we all have done it. We have made the conference successful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ujjal. Thank you, Professor Ujjaljit.
Huh?
And I must also add thanks to the technical support team, particularly Shilajit Bishash, who has been providing the support and the YouTube links and everything else. And to all the students who dropped in and out but took a very keen interest. I think they are the people who will eventually take it on from here. It's a platform for them. Uh, there's going to be a feedback link which would be mailed to all if you kindly fill it out and submit. It is a Google form, so a submitting would do. The student presenters are here, or some of them were here and have left, but they would be reminded, like Robin said. And I would request Ujjaljit and others who were there, like there were in papers even in the previous webinar, and in we could consider them. We have plans of considering them and sending them over for the student paper which the DLS has already announced. And I think the last day would be somewhere 15th of December.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank
Yes,
you, Swati.
yes.
I would appreciate that. Yes.
So, yes, we have already had plans about getting the papers, choosing from here. If anybody would like to send, otherwise, they always welcome. But we have had some very good student papers, and so we would be asking you to submit, though, redo it and submit, or whatever it is that would be necessary, so that we can make a formal submission that not us, but you can make, but we can go for go on with it. So that would be a final word to the students who have been eagerly participating, the new generation taking to Lessing with all our fingers crossed. And thank you, Ujjal, for being there as a very solid as a rock.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Swati. And thank you, everyone. So,
Good.
so
We
good
have a solid
night.
night. Yes.
Yes.
Good.